How's it going, everyone? It's your favorite apostates. I'm McKay.
I'm Jordan.
And welcome back to us, obviously. Thanks for joining us again. We took a little bit of a hiatus. It got crazy there for a minute. We were getting sick because, it's the fall. And Jordan's schedule is you're totally full now at this point, right?
Just about.
Maybe 1 or 2 spots per week to fill, and it's just been crazy. We've been trying to get back on top of it. So here we are. Please forgive us. We love you. Thank you.
And if you didn't join us for our 100,000 subs live stream, thank you.
Oh my God.
Thank you for helping us get to 100,000.
Check it down there. Go look down there. See that little check mark?
Official.
You guys did that.
Never in a million years did we
guys
think
did
we
that.
would be here. We have our little plaque. Go watch the live stream if you haven't already. So thank you. But we have a lot to get to today, so we're not going to spend much time dilly-dallying or yapping, because we're going to yap your ear off in 5 minutes. We're not going to spend much time talking about other things. We're going to hop right into our very broad and very thorough topic for today.
It comes as no surprise to me that large portion of our audience is from the United States. There's a lot of foreign viewers, and unfortunately with the stuff that's going on in the United States, particularly today, which is the United States election day for the presidential election race going on right now, things are popping off. And I understand if you don't live here, you don't give a shit, go ahead. You have my pass. I understand that this shit, you probably have already thought about it more than you deserve to have thought about it, because we have as well, and it just never ends. Of course, 'tis the season to see where what the Mormons are up to, because we always have to go and check that out. And the thing that really spurred this whole topic that we're going to be addressing today was this image that was posted in r/ex-Mormon. Obviously, this is the internet. There's not really verifiable evidence, but this photo was posted. If you're listening, this was received by somebody from Mormons who allegedly are Sunday school teachers at church, and it's a piece of candy that their kid was given that have stickers from supposedly Donald Trump campaign material, but homemade because they're freaks like that say "f*** your feelings," and they have little images of Donald Trump on Halloween candy. Just absolutely degenerate behavior, if you ask me.
My thoughts are, somehow within the Trump rhetoric, Mormons have decided that things like that are okay. Because, Mormons aren't allowed to swear.
Yeah, most of you would recognize this as abnormal behavior. You would not hear Mormons usually saying "f*** your feelings" when it comes to anything else, because God knows that if you said anything about their feelings when it comes to God,
well, and they're
and
just
their temples and
generally,
stuff, they'd get really pissed.
image-wise, they're just generally trying to be polite and neutral is the word that always comes to mind. People make fun of Mormons for being so milk toast and having a glow, because they're so they have a very particular image that they like to put forward.
Yeah.
And something like that's very inappropriate, and why are you giving it to children? Children can't even vote. Just seems very bizarre, but has been very normalized within the kind of Trump landscape of this presidency, really.
It probably doesn't come as a surprise to a lot of people, especially ex-Mormons, but there was a recent study, I'll throw it up on the screen here, that shows that of all and because of Mormonism, I'm going to use air quotes, mainstream and then furthermore Christian sects, Mormons are by and large the most right-leaning of them all.
Of the main, your
of
big
all the main
categories.
sects.
Assemblies of God, Lutherans, Southern Baptists, Catholics, your big boys. Okay.
Which is funny that they're even really counted as the big boys, because compared to a lot of these churches, they have
very small in membership,
minuscule numbers. I mean, they claim that they have 17 million members worldwide, and then I don't even know how many are supposed to be here in the United States, but...
This data is from 2014. This is the most recent that I could find of like this specific thing in general. And who knows, maybe things have shifted slightly, but I would venture to guess that they have not, simply because of kind of what we're going to get into here in a second. But I do find this very fascinating because the Mormon voting bloc remains pretty tried and true Republican, not just conservative Republican. Yeah. Like, they are going to vote like down the ticket. Everybody that has an R gets a vote. Very traditional Republican, which is kind of wild when, you know, there are other religions who have been around for longer, generally speak out politically more often than Mormonism does, and are not as Republican. So there's reasons as to why the Mormon voting bloc is important, especially to this election, which we're going to talk about in a second.
Just to drive the point home, it was like ubiquitous. And this isn't even, we didn't grow up in Utah. So people are going to say, oh, well, Utah is different from a lot of the other Mormons. Cool your jets, first off. But growing up, like, this was like across the board. It was well known that everybody at church, they all vote Republican. Even to the point where a good family friend of my family's, for a long time, because he was an ICU nurse when my brothers were born, and he was working in the ICU and everything. But for whatever reason, as a kid, my parents thought it was important that we know, oh, they're Democrats, because that was really weird. It was a really weird thing for Mormons to vote Democrats. So, I mean,
I went to elementary school with a McCain sticker on my backpack, and I handed them out to other kids at school, and my Mormon friend and I got in trouble for doing that, and they called my mom. And I got in trouble because I voted for Obama in our class election. I know.
And then meanwhile, I'm over here.
I got in trouble with my mom, let me be clear.
Maybe I can find a picture of me at a Romney rally before I could even vote. I was in high school. There I am in my little letter jacket at this Romney rally, because that was the thing to do. He was Mormon and Republican, so double whammy there. So, I mean, I'm sure a lot of you throw some stories in the comments, because I bet that a lot of people have a lot of experiences with Mormons, Republicans. Like, that is just how it is.
And you might be wondering, why are we talking about this? Politics and Mormonism. Mormonism is small by numbers in population compared to all the other religious groups. They've had, Mitt Romney, who ran for president, who is Mormon, but that's pretty, otherwise Mormon and politics don't necessarily go together in people's minds. But there's lots of reasons why they do go together, especially if you live in the U.S. or if you're American. But otherwise, if you're just, interested, then I'm glad you're here also. But there's reasons that these two things are like very interconnected, and especially with people like presidents and Mormon prophets. Presidents, Mormon prophets. Why are they together? Why do we have photos of them? Why are they coming and speaking in Mormon buildings like the Tabernacle? Like, this is like the Mormon political connection is deeper than you might think. And if you're not Mormon, it's not going to be as or ex-Mormon, it's not going to be as obvious to you. But for somebody like me, who's always had a fascination with politics, you have seen this connection and have seen it run through the history of Mormonism literally since its inception. So in order to give you an accurate picture of how Mormonism got here and why they're even represented in politics, being such a minority religious group, we have to go back in time quite a bit. Because, like I said, the beginning of Mormonism is really the beginning of Mormon politics. Like the inception of the Mormon church really is where it all begins. And yes, we have to go back that far so I can give you all of the connections, because they are vast and they span decades, starting really in like the 1840s. That's where we're going to begin. Once that happens, once you have the history picture, we'll bring you up to speed. We'll connect it back to now. We'll make connections along the way, right? And we'll come to today's day and age where you can see why it will start to hopefully make sense for you, why this matters, how we got here, and why things might be hopefully slightly different, even if just in small numbers, maybe in swing states where it counts, this time around.
To begin, I want you to run to your internet browser, google.com, and just Google who was the first presidential candidate to be assassinated.
We'll pause for a second to give you a second.
Wouldn't you know it? Joseph Smith Jr., the first ever presidential candidate to be assassinated? That's wild, but yes, it is true. Joseph Smith Jr., founder of the Mormon Church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as we know it today, was a presidential candidate in the 1844 presidential election. A lot of I won't say a lot. Some historians believe that he ran as like a protest of sorts after Martin Van Buren, 8th president of the United States, refused to help him with the persecution that the Mormons were facing in Missouri. Just a little context for that. The Mormons, they had ended up in Missouri. There's a really long version, but the short version of that was tensions were really high between the Mormons there in Missouri and the other people who were in Missouri, and that culminated in Governor Leland Boggs at the time issuing an extermination order that essentially expelled Mormons at the threat of death, which we're not going to get into around this time. But so yeah, Joseph Smith went to Martin Van Buren allegedly, and he didn't help them with any of that.
But let's be clear. While extermination orders, particularly of a religious group, are never okay, don't let the Mormons get you thinking that Joseph and the Mormons didn't do anything to aggravate the people there at the time. Did they deserve that kind of a reaction? No. But were they doing things that pissed the other people off that got them to that point that were justified?
Absolutely.
Yes. Okay, so with putting this together, me as a human being, I'm trying to weave together the Mormon history, the politics of it all, and something that we are going to come back to throughout this that I feel like would be a critical error not to mention is also the role of racism that also interweaves, if you will, through Mormon politics and Mormon history. I could not complete this, and this isn't even like a history book. Like, you want histories of Mormonism, like, we're talking volumes, people. Like, we're talking volumes on volumes. So this is a very simplified version for the purposes of what we're trying to do today. So there were people I couldn't include. There were events that I had to skip. I tried to get in everything I could, but you're going to be here for like 8 hours if I were to do everything, probably longer. And nobody probably wants to sit through that for that long. So that being said, if there are things that are important, it's not that I forgot them and I didn't read about them. It's just that for the purpose of the timeline, I didn't have time. So don't get mad at me in the comments.
In fact, I'll take it one step further. Keep the conversation going in the comments.
Or add it if you think I did on purpose or something. Whatever. Like, that's fine. I don't care.
Yeah.
But I want to emphasize when people are like, well, this is a video about politics. Why are we talking about racism? So I'm just giving the full disclaimer that is why, and for even potentially a trigger warning, that there is talk of racism throughout this entire thing, because if you've been here before, you know that Mormonism and racism generally go hand in hand, unfortunately, especially in the beginning. Lots of Mormons, as part of this, and this is why I bring this up so soon, like to mention that Joseph Smith ran on an abolitionist platform, which at the time was somewhat surprising, given the majority of the other candidates. But Joseph Smith had plenty, unfortunately, of other statements that were rooted very deeply in racism and misogyny and other things, but obviously racism in this case, and actual support of slavery, and using Mormonism and religious texts, the Bible, to justify slavery and why it was okay. And so there's lots of confusion around this because people were so shocked that he decided to run as an abolitionist, but then also had this history, this well documented, you can go read the letters he wrote to his colleagues, and he even experienced during his life what seems to be some flip-flopping on how he actually felt, because there was a time where he said that he ordained somebody that was a black member of the church at the time, and then there's lots of discussion about people who might have lied about that incident, and there's just kind of lots of weird things happening here. But if you were to just objectively pull it up and stare at it and stare at the writings, they would be overwhelmingly racist and generally in support of the enslavement of people. Just putting that out there. So Mormons always get excited because they're like, Joseph Smith was an abolitionist. And I'm like,
But
I don't know that we can say that fully yet.
yeah. Well, and even more importantly, his successor, who I would say was the greatest influence on the church becoming the way that it is today, Brigham Young. I mean, he brought enslaved people of his own to Utah Territory when they arrived there. Their names are forever ensconced on the plaque. So
don't worry. Joseph, also in his political platform, also advocated very heavily for, like, you know, we say jokingly in Utah, people are like, separation of church and state. What's that? We don't know. Joseph Smith wanted church and state marriage. Like, he wanted, like, boinking church and state. Like, marriage was not even enough, okay? So he says, and I quote, "I go emphatically, virtuously, and humanely for a theodemocracy," that's the exact word, "where God and the people hold the power to conduct the affairs of men in righteousness." Now, if that's not very, very right-leaning from the very, very beginning, I don't know what is. This is, like, God and politics are completely merged. There is no healthy separation between the two, and it is it is part of what I'm doing. Like, the missionaries during Joseph Smith's time, during when he was campaigning, not only were, like, trying to bring people to Mormonism, they were also campaigning for him for presidency. So there was no separation of church and state really at that time. Like McKay said at the beginning of this, Joseph Smith was killed in June of 1844. So he was the first president to be assassinated, which is the first running for president person to candidate to be assassinated. Obviously, his campaign ended swiftly in 1844. No more political involvement was had at that time. Nobody else decided to step up the plate and run. It seemed like a very personal, in my opinion, vendetta due to the communication between him and Martin Van Buren. Joseph Smith was a very vengeful person, in my opinion, so it does not surprise me that he would do something, not even for the... He even had a statement that he made, either he wrote to a friend or that he gave in a speech where he was like, "I fear I might be president." Because he was kind of worried.
I fear you're not, dog.
He was kind of worried
I fear
that
you
this
probably
was gonna work.
were not even in the top. But whatever.
So it seemed like an impulse decision, and who knows how it actually would have fared. I doubt they would have done well anyway. Swiftly ended in 1844. So without giving you a whole crap ton of Mormon context about what happened during that time, that's a whole lot of things. Sort of a separation between some Mormons deciding to be with Brigham Young and some not. So mainstream Mormonism is what we do, as what we have today, is what we would call Brighamite Mormonism, which is the people who went with Brigham Young after Joseph Smith was killed. So the majority of Mormons will make the trek, as you know, if you know anything about Mormons, with Brigham Young into Utah Territory, which is where really the rest of our political story will take place. And as McKay mentioned, Brigham Young brought enslaved people that he had with him into Utah Territory, and then he made himself the governor, where he also legalized enslavement of Black and Indigenous people in 1852, and then forbade them from doing things that the other people with him were able to do, like vote, join the military, or marry white people specifically. So Brigham had enslaved people himself, and then horrifyingly, he also, and the church also, accepted enslaved people as a form of tithing.
Speaking of separation of church and state, we're going to fast forward a little bit. Utah Territory is organized in like the 1850s. We're going to go forward to someone who was running for Senate for Utah Territory in the very, very early 20th century by the name of Reed Smoot, which was an interesting little tidbit of history.
We'll come back to.
Because Reed Smoot was an apostle, and he was trying to be elected as a senator for Utah Territory. Or was it a state?
He was elected.
And he was elected. But because of that little being an apostle for the church, they needed to hold some hearings, which lasted several years, in which a lot of stuff that the church probably didn't want to come out actually came out. And one of those really, really concerning bits of history that came out was something from the temple endowment ceremony that was added after the death of Joseph Smith Jr. and his brother Hiram.
Which takes us back to our timeline, remember?
Yeah, we're jumping around, so stick with us. But the very important part that was added to the temple endowment ceremony is colloquially known as the blood oath, which is what members would take every time that they would enter the temple and do vicarious work for the
Slash
dead.
the oath of vengeance.
Yeah, the oath of vengeance, the blood oath. There's a little bit of oath of vengeance is probably a better word because there's a little bit of muddied terminology there. The script that the members would say out loud and what they were commanded to do
Inside the temple.
This is on
This is top
the record.
secret.
This is on the record. There's no lies here. This
Multiple
was
eyewitness accounts.
under oath that they had to reveal this because of these hearings. We're saying, you and each of you do covenant and promise that you will pray and never cease to pray to Almighty God to avenge the blood of the prophets upon this nation, and that you will teach the same to your children and to your children's children unto the third and fourth generation.
So this was part of the covenants that you would make. You promised to basically avenge the blood of Joseph Smith, and this applied to any other martyrs at the time. This could apply to anybody who would fall under this if there were more, because Brigham was worried there would be more.
Okay.
So you're basically in a religious ceremony that we
Yes.
did later on, years later. It's the same one.
Yeah.
That's not in there anymore.
They cut that after this whole Reed Smoot
We'll
hearing
come back
thing,
to that too. But nonetheless, that was in there and members were agreeing to do this. So when I say more like Joseph was vengeful,
yeah.
Brigham was also very vengeful, and the Mormons were very agitated by this.
I mean, can you imagine you're holding these hearings and you're like, this guy is going to represent us in the United States Senate and he's going to be making laws on the federal level, and he's in his temple swearing to God and angels before everybody that they will avenge the blood of the prophets upon the nation that he's supposed to be serving? That
Yes.
would obviously be cause for concern.
Another thing that goes hand in hand with this that I want to bring up, that McKay and I have actually talked about on the channel before, not very in depth, but we have talked about it before, is that Brigham was I hate to say supporter, but that's the only way I can think of phrasing this. Brigham talked about blood atonement, which is this idea that there are certain sins that are only punishable, like by your death. Like you give your blood to be atoned for these certain specific sins. Now, we could probably do a video on blood atonement itself, but like again, where racism plays a role in this, 1863, Brigham's preaching at the Tabernacle at Temple Square as we know it, that interracial marriage was forbidden by God and penalty would be blood atonement. So this was something that was utilized, I don't want to say often, but once is plenty. But this idea that marrying someone outside of your race was punishable by death, and he would find a way to enforce that. So that, coupled with the fact that he also said that Joseph Smith and any other martyrs that would die for the church's cause would be atoned for in God's due time, and quote, their blood was crying to God day and night for vengeance. So like, this is, you can see why maybe the people who were existing around Mormons at the time were a little bit uncomfortable and a little bit uneasy about them entering politics.
Now, a lot of these events in the early years of Utah and it becoming a state and everything is kind of where we begin to understand Mormons' alignment with the Republican Party and distaste toward big government and government overreach. Mm-hmm. So in order to kind of understand that, we need to look back on Mormonism and its involvement in Utah with the U.S. government. Now, back in 1856, the Republican Party took up the anti-polygamy cause, and at the time, Mormons were actively practicing polygamy, and they were owning enslaved people. So those kinds of things probably are going to be a pressure point.
Also, I want to point out that it is interesting to me that, and it's even when I was reading this when we were deconstructing, it's always been interesting to me that the Republican Party are the ones that took up the anti-polygamy cause. It is very interesting. I'm just going to like shelf that, but
it was before the Southern Strategy.
Fair.
And then in 1857, President James Buchanan attempted to remove Brigham Young as the governor, as I was stating before, and sent forces to Utah, which would later be named the starting events of the Utah or the Mormon War. There was also the horrible Mountain Meadows massacre that happened during this time, where a wagon train of immigrants and the Mormons tried to pass the buck because they were disguised as Paiute tribe,
Indigenous
people, and they tried to pass it off as, oh, it was just the indigenous people acting up again, hence the extermination order that
a few of them were charged for that.
And then the resolution finally came through after negotiations that federal authority could enter Utah, and in exchange, Mormons were granted a pardon for any potential acts of rebellion, excluding the Mountain Meadows massacre.
So essentially, the federal government, who is very displeased with Utah at this point. The Mormon War was fairly brief and not
really like
murderous.
A war, but
it was not like it's called that, but there were not very many battles, and it was mainly a lot of like failed negotiations between the federal government wanting to get into Utah and instill their own governor, and Brigham Young being a bitch about it, basically. So the idea with this is they eventually came to the agreement that Brigham Young said, you're not going to punish us for anything that we've done in terms of rebellion, and we will let you come into the territory. And they agreed to that. But Mountain Meadows wasn't exclusionary. There were a few people that were held responsible for the events that happened in Mountain Meadows. And then just to also illustrate, I think it's important to illustrate what's happening with racism and Mormonism in politics at this time as well, so that you can kind of get the landscape for why Mormons might have been responding to things in a certain way. In 1866, Thomas Coleman, who was an African-American man, was found murdered in Salt Lake City. I'm trying to be mindful of how I word this because I think it's important, but I also don't want YouTube to be pissed off at us about this. The method for which that happened resembled the penalties of Mormon temple rituals. In my opinion, in Mormon history, this is one of the more gruesome and heinous things simply based off that fact alone. Simply based off the method of which was clearly a message. And then there was a warning inscribed on a sheet of paper and attached to him, as reported by Salt Lake Daily Telegraph, which was news at the time. So this is actually recorded. Anybody who wants to beef with me can go and look this up. This actually comes from a book that I've read called Mormon and White Supremacy that's written by Joanna Brooks. And I will reference her work often throughout this. But I want to emphasize, from the very beginning, Mormons did not take a passive response with Black and Indigenous people to the point that they were doing things like this. So I just want that to be part of the landscape as you imagine how Mormons are kind of making a name for themselves and their religion in Utah. Within those same few years later, there was actually a mission president named John Morgan who during a sermon at Tabernacle, I believe, at Temple Square, basically endorsed lynching, which basically sent the message to members that it was this was not a passive involvement. Mormonism and Mormon members were actively involved with this from the very beginning, which is just horrific.
Additionally, in 1882, U.S. Congress passed a law making polygamy a felony, and
much worse than what they were doing at the beginning.
Yeah, right. And then, so 1,300 Mormons were imprisoned related to this law, and the church's prophet at the time spent years hiding from federal authorities because he was practicing polygamy. Shortly after that came the Edmunds Tucker Act of 1887, which dissolved the church, justified by the church encouraging polygamy. And an additional consequence of this act was disenfranchisement of women in Utah.
I wanted to bring this point up because this is always a talking point that comes up for Mormons, is Utah was one of the first states to give women the right to vote. Now, that's interesting if you didn't know the context around that. So I pulled this quote specifically from Jean Bickmore White, who wrote this whole thing from the Utah History Encyclopedia, that I think gives very important context as to why. This is why when we talk about history, that context matters, okay? On its surface, it sounds really nice. Wow, Utah's really progressive, giving women the right to vote. That's so cool. But, okay, it's more than that, right? So she says, in sharp contrast to the long fight for women's suffrage nationally, the vote came to Utah women in 1870 without any effort on their part. It had been promoted by a group of men who had left the Mormon church, the Godbeats? I don't know how to pronounce that. in their Utah magazine, but to no immediate effect. At the same time, an unsuccessful effort to gain the vote for women in Utah Territory had been launched in the East by anti-polygamy forces. They were convinced that Utah women would vote to end plural marriage if given the chance. Brigham Young and others realized that giving women the vote would not mean the end of polygamy, but it could change the predominant national image of Utah women as downtrodden and oppressed, and could help to stem a tide of anti-polygamy legislation by Congress. With no dissenting votes, the territorial legislature passed an act giving the vote, but not the right to hold office, to women on February 10th, 1869. The act was signed 2 days later by the acting governor, and on February 14th, the first woman voter in the municipal election reportedly was Sarah Young, grandniece of Brigham Young. Utah thus became the second territory to give the vote to women. Wyoming had passed a women's suffrage act in 1869, and no states permitted women to vote at the time. The context for this is really important, as people were like, oh, if we give it to women, then they'll abolish polygamy themselves because the women don't want polygamy, which was their first mistake, because part of the questions that we get, like in this whole thing, one of the questions that we got when we kind of posed this on Instagram was, do women in Mormonism feel like they have to vote the way their husband votes, which has been kind of a topic of more recent conversation. And I think this is a good example of, could that be at play here? Sure. Could it also be that women also believe these things, even if it is for their ultimate non-benefit, like in today's terms? But women don't see any problem necessarily with polygamy in this context. So Brigham Young wasn't even worried about giving them the vote because they knew they weren't going to vote against the church. And if you think deeper about the population of Utah at the time, the majority of women there are Mormon. And so we're going to establish kind of a majority by also giving them this right. So while I love the fact that Utah's up there with, not as, like, I think Wyoming was the first, but
sorry,
is
but
up there.
Who was living in Wyoming in the 1800s?
But I think it's fascinating that this happened because the context here is really important. But this law that unfortunately disincorporated the church also took away women's right to vote. Like, that went out the window with this law. And that law was of more consequence to Mormons, and more Mormons got in trouble because they had outlined that even cohabitating with multiple women was practicing polygamy. So the cohabitation rule was essentially what got so many of these other people in trouble, because they weren't saying it was just like the marriage thing. It's like, oh, if you're living together, which is why so many of them got in trouble for this.
Well, I would just like to bring up the point regarding if people were wondering if they would vote in favor of this. It would make a lot of sense to me, because you have to remember that the endowment ceremony before, like just a couple years ago, like 5 or 6 years ago, the wording in making the covenant, what's the first covenant? Anyway,
blasted that shit from my brain.
My brain is drawing a blank. But one of the first covenants that you make when you're in the temple, you are seeing Adam and Eve basically be married, and Adam covenants with God to Adam covenants with God to hearken unto his counsel and to obey him. But Eve doesn't do that. Eve covenants with her husband to listen to him and obey him. And there was nothing that had to do with God. It was just between her and him and God. Mm-hmm. So you have to remember you're in that framework where they wouldn't vote against their husband because they've covenanted in a temple of God to hearken unto his counsel and to obey him. Mm-hmm. So they probably were thinking, we got this shit on fucking lock. If we just let the ladies vote, they're going to do whatever we tell the brethren to do. Yep. So then, after taking polygamy all the way to the Supreme Court and losing magically, Wilford Woodruff, who was the prophet at the time, gets a revelation known as the 1890 Manifesto, which is in fact canonized as Mormon scripture in the Pearl of Great Price. You can go and you can read it. Woodruff said that on the cold September evening in 1890, that revelation from Jesus Christ reversed the church's position on polygamy. Notably, the manifesto did not specify an end to existing polygamous marriages, and it would later be observed that the church continued to perform polygamous marriages, but only in secret. This outward change would essentially secure Utah Territory's plea to be recognized as a state, and
The benefits that come with that.
Yeah.
They knew polygamy was their biggest barrier here. So wouldn't it be convenient that when they've hit the end of their rope, the Supreme Court denies their case and says, nope, we're not helping you. And they're like, well, polygamy seems to stand between us and statehood. And so I guess it's time for God to change his mind.
It's time for God to fall in line with every scripture in the Bible and actually the Book of Mormon in regards to polygamy. And
isn't that interesting?
Yeah, it was kind of wild. A wild few years that God was like, yeah, you should get married to a bunch of women. And then all of a sudden he's like, no, we're not doing that anymore. No. Especially because it's a barrier to Utah becoming a state.
Mm-hmm. Interestingly, the political climate of the time, remember we're here 1870s, led most Mormons to be Democrats because the Republican Party at the time opposed statehood for Utah. So this is interesting again, where we have kind of a big difference comparing. I mean, if they're opposing your statehood, like, yes, I understand it. It makes sense. But when you're looking at it through the eyes of like, and the lens of what we know about Mormons and how they lean today, this is interesting. And then in 1898, the first Mormon was elected to Congress and was refused his seat due to being a polygamist. And then that launches us into 1903, where we have what McKay mentioned just a few minutes ago, which was the Reed Smoot incident, which is actually more popular. I've heard like non-Mormons bring this up and talk about this.
That's crazy because I had never heard about Reed Smoot until
we left.
Until we left, yeah.
So remember, he was elected to Senate. So he had the votes. He got there, was also an apostle of the church at the time. So he's in church leadership. And the overall climate of people's opinions on Mormonism at the time is still really shaky. And the U.S. government decides to hold a hearing to see if he should be allowed his seat. And this hearing went on for 4 years. Like, they had the Reed Smoot hearings went on for 4 years. So what I found really interesting, there's lots of people who have written about it. So if you're curious about the whole thing, like, go read about it. There's oral testimony and the prophet had to be there and it was like a whole thing. So if you're interested in that, by all means. But historian Kathleen Flake, who actually wrote a book about the Smoot hearing, said at the height of the hearing, some senators were receiving 1,000 letters a day from angry constituents. What remains of these public petitions fills 11 feet of shelf space, the largest such collection in the National Archives. This is how upset people were about this issue.
That's my history. Time. My fucking people.
Isn't
Mormons,
that
baby.
wild? Like, can you imagine, like, in the context of how we do things today, like 11 feet of shelf space were just people who were handwriting and maybe typing, but for the most part, taking time out of their day because they were so pissed off at this instance. So 4 years pass. At the end of the hearings, a decision is made, a vote was held, and Smoot was able to maintain his seat. So 4 years of that to maintain your seat.
Crazy.
And then as part of these hearings, because people were, having to come and speak and they were under oath, the prophet of the church at the time, Joseph F. Smith, which is the OG Joseph Smith, starter of the church's nephew, was charged and fined for polygamy.
Here's a little fun fact for the day. Russell Marion Nelson, prophet of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, prophet president, today, living today, sitting president, was born in 1924. He's 100 years old. In 1925, the following year after his birth, was the last recorded lynching that took place in Price, Utah.
This is last recorded. Probably, maybe not last, but last recorded.
Yeah. A crowd estimated at 1,000 people, including families with children carrying picnic baskets, gathered to see Robert Marshall, an African-American miner and fellow Mormon, hanged from a tree. That comes from Mormons and white supremacy. So just a little thing to think about. The sitting president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints
was alive,
older than the last recorded lynching in Utah. Just a little something to think about.
And I mean, there's no need to talk about how sinister it is because it is. But the fact that this person that they did this to was a fellow member. Like, this wasn't not that it would make it any better, but I would think that maybe some additional humanity would come into play with a fellow member. But that just goes to show how removed from that they all were. That this was a fellow Mormon, a fellow member,
Not that
it should matter.
Yeah, not that it should matter. It's somebody in their own community.
And they made like a fun day of it. And remember, the Oath of Vengeance, going back to that temple ceremony weird thing that we talked about a little while ago where they swore they would avenge the blood of the prophets, Joseph Smith, Hiram. Yeah, 1927, the Mormon Church decided to remove all references to vengeance and retribution in the temple ordinances, which was kind of the result of the prophet at the time, gathered a committee and said maybe we should remove that, and they ultimately decided to pull those things. And then they also altered a very popular hymn that McKay and I would often make fun of called Praise to the Man. There was apparently some kind of sketchy language in the original hymn, which they altered to be less vengeance-y. But it's still sung today. Yes, I have sang that song many times in my life.
Praise to the Man is the hymn that ruined Scotland the Brave for everybody, because they took a great pipe tune and made it to just glaze up Joseph Smith after he was killed. It's just literally
glazing Joseph Smith. Praise to the man who communed with Jehovah. It is all about Joseph Smith. But when people are like, Mormons get so offended when you ask if they worship Joseph Smith, but then they have this song and all this shit, and it's you're not making a great case,
Scotland the Brave, that slaps, but praise to the man.
It's very catchy.
In 1918, Heber J. Grant becomes the next prophet of the Mormon Church, and Mormonism seemed to take more of a uniform turn politically. Grant hated FDR. Franklin Delano Roosevelt as well. If you're not from the United States, you probably have not made it this far. But anyway, just for clarity purposes. And he claimed that the New Deal was socialism. Ooh, spooky.
Which, if you're also not from the U.S., the New Deal was kind of the president at the time's reforms and programs and ideas to essentially try to get the United States out of the Great Depression, but was not well received, I'll say.
Taking to his Joseph Smith's roots, he utilized the church-owned Deseret News and began publishing front-page editorials supporting his viewpoints. He was supported in these views by other mainstream church leaders. Despite some OG church members not abstaining from alcohol, the church continued its abstinence from alcohol position, which conflicted with FDR, who was a staunch supporter of repealing alcohol prohibition. It's also important to note that during the 1940s and 50s, LDS leaders advocated for the racial segregation of blood at the Utah hospital blood banks. And in some areas, this practice was upheld until the 1970s. The worry was that if white members were to receive black people's blood via blood transfusion, they would lose eligibility for the priesthood. It was also during this time that leaders were teaching missionaries to screen potential converts for black African lineage by scrutinizing phenotypic features so they could avoid having members of African descent.
Now, context that I think is important for all of this is members obviously have very racist beliefs, and Mormonism supports that in a few different ways. And a Mormonism and racism video is probably necessary and requires more time than we have today. But remember, black people, including black women, were not allowed to access church membership and church benefits the way that other Mormons were. So, black men weren't allowed to have the priesthood, but black women and black men weren't allowed to attend the temple. And so there's very stringent kind of blocks on their membership, which is why a lot of times they just avoided trying to get black members to join the church. They even there was some discussion as to whether or not they could convert enslaved people. And I think it was, I can't remember who it was that ultimately decided, and maybe it was Brigham Young that decided if it didn't have permission of the enslaved people's person in charge, then they weren't allowed to convert. But it's not very convincing or enticing for really any black members, because it's okay, you guys kind of implicitly endorse lynching, and your doctrine is racist because of all the Mark of Cain bullshit, and if I join, I don't even get to do all the other things that you guys get to do.
I
so
still
what
get
exactly,
to be a second-class citizen.
So, like, what exactly is pulling me towards Mormonism? And obviously that is by design, right? Like, they don't want Black members, and they are willing to do heinous things to make sure that they are not converting Black members. So I think it's important here that as we start to get into the 1950s and 1960s, that we talk about the shift of the public perception of Mormonism, because it plays such a significant role of human politics. Because if we look at where we've come to this point, it is a lot of very intense beef between Utah Mormons and the federal government. It is extreme uneasiness with people around Mormons who live close to them, and bad interactions and extreme hesitation. And Mormons, despite what you view them as now, like, the perception of Mormons was like a lot of sexual deviancy. And so that's a lot of what dictated the perception, largely because of their response to the legislation around polygamy. Like, because of the federal government's ideas around polygamy and it being immoral, like, Mormons were very quickly branded as immoral people and deviant and nasty and just overall, like, horrible public perception. So it's hard to imagine up to this point in Mormon history how we can get to, you know, where we are today, where, like, Mormonism, like, Mormons and Republicans are like bestest friends. Like, it's hard to imagine how we ever got to that point where Mormons are even not viewed in such a, like, horrible light. So I wanted to include this because this does turn the tide on public perception politically, especially, which is kind of how we were able to get to where we are today. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we got there and why it changed, because at this point in time, it's hard to see how anybody would have a favorable opinion of Mormonism.
So during this image revitalization, this rebranding period in the 50s and 60s, the Mormons began to want to broaden their appeal, mostly to the right, or white people, you can say. Did I execute it? Okay.
Yes.
And part of rehabbing their image was the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, which is like the crown jewel of Mormonism and the arts.
It's not called that anymore. What is it?
It's called the Tabernacle Choir at Temple Square,
There we go.
which is fucking major downgrade.
Because can't have Mormon in there anymore.
In the words of Joanna Brooks, the choir offered a new image of Mormons as clean, disciplined, industrious, wholesome, and patriotic. Gone are the polygamous sexual deviants, and in are the conservative, wholesome white patriots. The choir became very successful even outside the Mormon sphere. Now you're probably wondering, what does this have to do with politics? Music is political, right? You shouldn't be wondering that. Hello? Well, in 1959, their song Battle Hymn of the Republic won a Grammy and an invitation to perform at the White House, and the presidential inauguration of Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, and every Republican president who would follow, including, most recently, Donald J. Trump. Ronald Reagan even dubbed them America's Choir. And yes, the choir was all white Mormons, if you hadn't already guessed that. It was not until 1970 that 2 black women were admitted to the Mormon Tabernacle Choir for the first time.
So if you didn't know, we've already talked about how Joseph Smith ran for president. And then if you're familiar with politics in the U.S. at all, you're probably familiar with Mitt Romney. If you are well-versed in politics, then you might even remember George Romney, who is Mitt Romney's dad, who actually ran for president himself in 1968. So George and his son both ran for president, which is fascinating to me. And his mom also ran for a Senate seat.
Just a dynasty of
a political
politics.
Dynasty over
we
here.
are already at the politics part. Holy
I know,
shit.
right? Crazy. So George was like well known to be Mormon, but interestingly, according to historians, it was not mentioned often in his campaign. Which in my mind, and to the historians that are kind of pointing this out, this is a pretty stark comparison to Joseph Smith. And in 2012, what we would later see years later with Mitt Romney, where it was essentially like a cornerstone of his campaign, even if he didn't want it to be. Another thing that clashed with George and his running was that George Romney was pro-civil rights and actually participated in some like civil rights marches and things, which was really in conflict with Mormonism, because Mormonism, like we'll come to talk about in a few minutes, was very kind of staunchly against civil rights, especially the prophet at the time. But if you weren't in like the Mormonism world and hearing the prophet speak negatively about civil rights, what was happening was essentially George was positively reflecting his civil rights activism because he was Mormon. So people assumed like, oh, Mormons are for civil rights then because their person that's running for president wouldn't be for that if it's against his religion.
Yeah.
You know? So George actually got a lot of criticism from Mormons because of that, which I found really interesting. But it was religion with his campaign was just not as part of it as it would be, as we would see for his son years later. George would go on to withdraw from the race after polls for the primary placed him way behind Nixon, who would go on to get the Republican National Convention nomination and actually become 37th president of the United States if you're not from around here. But Nixon would actually go on to name Romney Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. So George had an active position in Nixon's cabinet. But they had, apparently, this was really interesting to me. If you don't care about politics, you're probably like, why do you care about this? But apparently they had a very contentious relationship. And according to sources, Nixon actually tried to get rid of George like multiple times. But every time Nixon would propose something that he would hope would get George to quit, George would just fold and agree with whatever Nixon said. So I found this really interesting. But after Romney would eventually resign from his cabinet following Nixon's reelection, and lots of people have very strong opinions about Nixon anyway. So this is interesting to me because this is just another political aspect of Mormonism, as we did have another Mormon person campaign for president that didn't get the nomination from the Republican National Convention. But his parents, or the Romney family, which is very prominent in Utah, actually have they donated and they created a room for him at BYU in the Master of Public Administration department. So I will put that up on your screen. He's not despite his disagreement at the time with church on civil rights, he's not looked at as Mormons now through a poor lens, which I think is important to point out. He's not it's despite the fact that they were obviously very different on that issue, it does not reflect currently in the Mormon perception of him today.
In 1972, Congress passed the Equal Rights Amendment, or ERA, which made an amendment to the U.S. Constitution guaranteeing that equal rights could not be denied by government or states based on gender. When Utah voted on its ratification in 1975, it failed horribly. Prophet president at the time, Spencer W. Kimball, made a statement opposing the ERA in 1976, and then in 1978 saying that the ERA was an encouragement of those who seek a unisex society and an increase in the practice of homosexual and lesbian activities, which sounds like a good time to me. Whatever, dog. To this day, the ERA still remains unratified. Even as recent as 2024, Democrats in Utah, few in number, have been trying to ratify the ERA with no success.
So ERA remains it does not remain ratified in Utah. And in the time that I lived in Utah, I think it came up in legislation at least twice, and it does not pass. Because, of my opinion, the influence of Mormons in politics on this and the percentage of Utah politicians that are Mormon, which is pretty grand in nature and we'll come back to. But this is, we talk about the involvement of racism. This is also the presence of sexism throughout as well.
Also connected to their politics, the church began to orient its public relations efforts around the family. And when you are thinking about the political climate today, what is the party that is talking about the family, particularly the nuclear family?
That's why I bring this up.
How can we deeply connect Mormons and the idea of family so closely that they can never be separated? It seemed to be another way to rehab the Mormon image.
primarily the doctrine. Like, you think about Mormonism offers something that a lot of other religions don't explicitly offer, which is if you are Mormon and you do what you're supposed to do and you follow all the rules, then you will be with your family for eternity.
Yeah.
Like, you will be with your family forever. Now, this is really, like, intense work to rehab an image of, like, polygamy, sexual deviancy. Okay?
Again, from Joanna Brooks, we read, this theology, as translated through the vernacular of American culture and politics, also fostered a dedicated focus in church programming and Mormon life on heterosexual, monogamous married couples with young and school-aged children.
The church has a public relations department. The church has marketing. The church is aware that it needs to rehab the image, like, severely, because what has been is not helping. And they have a lot of history to contend with to try to turn the tide of people's perspectives, especially people in Utah. So what better way than to pick something that is so milquetoast and so bland and so not controversial? Family. Like, there's nothing controversial about that. Yeah. Spending more time with your kids, that's a good thing. Family things, those are good things. Like, if they can pair the Mormon perception with family and link those two things together, then people are like, oh, they're just like, they're wholesome, patriotic, American, white bread people. You know what I mean? So that was what we were kind of aiming for. So what's fascinating about this is I actually remember watching these at some point in my Mormon journey.
Which is funny because I feel like I've never seen any of these ones in particular.
So in 1972, as part of this kind of like public relations initiative, the church launches through its subsidiary television station and production companies the quote home front quote series of public like safety service announcements advocating time spent with families. So they basically launched like a Mormon commercial that's not a commercial, that's focusing on families. So Joanna goes on to say that within 4 years, according to church officials reported the series was playing on 95% of American television stations. That's not 95% of Mormon
or Utah local.
That is American television stations. So even though these were like just straight up basically ads for Mormonism, people were watching them and the tides were turning. Yeah. So I wanted to give you an example of some of these because they're super dated and I find a lot of them like really amusing. But I wanted to give you some examples so you can have an idea. Obviously, these are dated. These were playing in the 70s. So quality is subpar, but I wanted to give you an idea of what some of these looked like.
Remember last week when you said next week you'd spend more time with your children?
No, I remember.
It's next week. Someone who's been there, who knows just how you feel. That's what families are for.
Mom, I finished the dishes. Did you clean the sink? Dad! Dad! Dad!
Hey!
I got your ways!
How many times do I have to tell you not to slam the door?
Mom, I'm home from the store. Hope you got everything.
Hi, Dad. I'm almost through with the lawn.
Just don't forget to sweep off the walk.
Mom, I came home like you wanted.
Did you put your bike away?
When you ignore accomplishments, you rob your children and yourself of some very satisfying moments.
Dad!
Hey!
I got your ways!
Great! Come on up. Let's take a look at it.
Like, the idea is, like, they're very, like, a lot of them are very quick. Like, they're a few seconds long, very succinct, very to the point. And it's, like, you know, parenting advice. It's family-oriented. It's, you know, you forgot you were going to spend more time with your kids this week. Here's your reminder, sponsored by the Mormons. Like, it's just this weird, like, I'm very curious. Like, I hope there's people who watch this who remembered this and were watching this at the time and remembered the public perception of this, because I'm very curious what people thought about the home front ads.
What was the overlap? I bet these were playing when the Osmonds were on.
Yes, they were.
So.
They were. which we're going to talk about the Osmonds in a second. But it's fascinating to me that this was part of it. Like, this is how they were going to rehab their image, and this was how, like, the entirety of it is just, like, it almost makes me nostalgic. It's, like, kids on their bikes and their parents helping them, and it's, you know, kids coming home from school and their parents are being nice to them, and, like, it's just very, very simplistic, but gets across a message that, like, Mormons are family oriented, care about parenting their kids, and are very wholesome. And that is, like, marketing in terms of people that I think goes a long way.
So we can tell at this point the image of the Mormons was full evolution.
We're getting there.
So much that one journalist from the New York Times wrote, to many casual observers, the American family of the mid-20th century appears headed down the drain in a swirl of divorce, drugs, venereal disease, alcohol, adultery, and group sex. But for at least one sizable group, sizable? That's generous.
Her words, not mine.
In American society, the family is still the thing. The group is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Mormons, and their way of attacking delinquency and deteriorating morality is to strengthen family solidarity through a Monday night get-together in the home called the Family Home Evening.
Now, this was Judy Clemsred. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but she was a journalist for the New York Times, and this was published in 1973. And so they are successfully rehabbing this image to be like, and you know, what's fascinating to me and why I wanted to include this quote specifically, like, what does that sound like? That seems like that same fucking bullshit that you and I hear every fucking day on the news, is that the nuclear family is falling apart, and divorce and drugs and STDs and group sex, and like group sex has just been replaced by, you know, people being afraid of polycules, and like this, like the idea of this is the same.
Gender theory and moral panic, whatever.
It's literally the same. It's just a little bit updated. And that's why I wanted to include this. Was what's fascinating to me about this is people are looking at Mormons and they're going, oh, they are the solution to the disintegration of the American nuclear family. And when you hear that as a fine-tuned Republican at this time, that's going to set off alarm bells for you. Like, I mean, there is a religion, another one, you know, you can compare Catholicism, you know, Baptist, Protestants, whatever. But there is a religion who is specifically tackling this and talking about very specific ways of how you can do that and keep your family moral. And, like, of course that's going to appeal to people at the time, especially when we have, like, you know, we're not far off from the satanic panic. Yeah. People are freaking out about disintegration of the family, and you're telling me that somebody is offering me a solution to those problems. I might not want to go become a member of that, but I'm also going to be more comfortable with them being my neighbors. So we have to talk about the Osmonds, because the Osmonds play a ginormous role in this as well. This is not my opinion, but this is something that was brought up in Joanna's book also, is that the idea that the Osmonds of the time were kind of like the more wholesome alternative, if you will, to the Jacksons, which is horrible and racist.
I was going to say wholesome,
white, and racist, like, on its face. But they were like Mormonism and the Osmonds. It was part of their brand. It was like, she's not, like, one of the sisters isn't allowed to date till she's 16, and her brothers are very protective of her decisions and modesty and what she wears. And the Osmonds aren't allowed to date until 16, so they're not having teen group sex. They're being very wholesome. You know,
teen group sex.
The Jacksons might be over there, like, doing drugs, but there's no sex, drugs, and rock and roll over here, because the Osmonds are wholesome.
White.
Yes. The impact of the Osmonds on Mormonism, I tell you, cannot be understated. Like, I knew a person who converted during the Osmond era. She's obviously older than me. And she converted because they were the teen pop stars. Like, let's talk about, like, young people. Like, young people younger than McKay and I. The Osmonds were the One Direction of that era. Okay?
Which is wild to me.
Which is fucking crazy. But they were the One Direction of that time frame. Women, girls, swooned over the Osmonds. Deeply. So much so that everybody wanted to be like them. It's like the Taylor Swift phenomenon. Like, you want to know what she's wearing and you want to wear it. You want to know what perfume she wears because you're going to go buy it. It's like that same kind of effect. Is people knew that the Osmonds were Mormon. So what are they going to do? They convert. The conversion boom that happened during the Osmond era was so vast that this person that I personally knew and talked to about her conversion, she said there were not enough missionaries to like accommodate the number of people who were interested in converting to the church, to the point that when she was converting, she was part of group lessons with the missionaries where she was like, we had like 25 of me and my best teenage girlfriends at the time in the house getting lessons from the missionaries. That is unfucking heard of and probably will never happen again.
The United States, that would never happen today.
Never happen. You have one person as a missionary taking the lessons and you're excited about that. They could not accommodate how many there were that were wanting to get baptized just because the Osmonds were Mormon. And so this is, again, rehabbing this image of wholesome, white, loves America, patriot, conservative, religious, like everything they would want. They were the good pop stars. Like, they were pop stars that people would be okay with their children listening to and wanting to be like. Now, the Osmonds kind of became mouthpieces for Mormonism in a way, in like implicit ways, but then the church decided to use them explicitly to kind of further the Mormon message. So, primetime interview with Barbara freaking Walters. I don't know if any of you were around at this time and remember this, but Barbara Walters interviewed them about their success and about Mormonism, and she asked hard-hitting questions about Black people and the priesthood and Mormonism, which is crazy.
I have to ask you something that I know that you have heard about, and if I don't ask it, people will wonder why I didn't. And that is, in the strength of your religion, the whole business about blacks not being allowed to be priests in the Mormon religion. Mm-hmm. Tell me how you feel about it and what the explanation for that is, would you, Donnie?
You bet. Well, I'm not an authority on the subject, but I will mention that we are not prejudiced people. We offer more, I think, than any other religion to the black person. And if you really want a good explanation and someone who has an authority about it, you should really talk to the general authorities of our church. Mm-hmm. They are not allowed to hold the priesthood in this right now, and I don't know why, but that's the way the Lord wants it.
But it's interesting to me that when talking about how politically the Mormon image was rehabbed, the Osmonds, a pop group, were instrumental in how that happened.
So this Barbara Walters interview is in 1978. And if you are familiar with Mormonism, you will know that the irony of it all is that same year, it was actually already decided at the same time that they were getting grilled by Barbara Walters. Allegedly, they had already decided that they were going to lift the priesthood ban and allow black men to receive the priesthood and allow black members, both men and women, to enter the temple, which was at the time, I mean, you have heard what we have been talking about. Absolutely, you would not have ever predicted that this was the trajectory of the church at that point for how all these racist, awful things were going on. On June 8th, 1978, after alleged prayerful counsel with the Lord, or as they say, the prophet of the church, Spencer W. Kimball, would announce via a letter, "He has heard our prayers and by revelation has confirmed that the long-promised day has come when every faithful, worthy man in the church may receive the holy priesthood, including the blessings of the temple. All worthy male members of the church may be ordained to the priesthood without regard for race or color." And notably, that is all that was ever said on the subject. There was no apology for any of the words of the prophets prior to, or any of the actions of the church in oppressing and playing a hand as the oppressor.
Nada.
against Black Americans at the time?
Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And they would not, maybe some offhand statements in some very non-public sitting in front of the church locations, but generally speaking, by and large, there still has never been, and church leadership has said that they don't make apologies. This is a perfect example of something where it was like Mormonism kind of blamed God. That this day was long promised.
Yeah.
That was not doctrinal.
That was definitely not part of any of the conversations that were happening prior to the 1970s, for sure. Especially not in the meeting rooms in the temple in Salt Lake City with all of the church leaders who supposedly have a direct conduit and line, some phone or some shit to God where they can talk to him. Yep. But somehow it slipped from the conversation and they were just like, you know what I think? I think that they should never have the priesthood and they should always be oppressed and slavery is God ordained. And I digress.
Wild. And if you go back and look, and maybe I'll screenshot some and give them to McKay to include, if you look at the quotes, if you look at the writings and the correspondence between especially early church leaders and even some of the later ones, they were absolutely confident that the law on Black people that was given apparently by God will never change. They said that it was like, that's just what it was. There was never this idea, maybe by some people, maybe hopeful Mormons of the time, it was never like we're just waiting for God to give us the go-ahead. It was, that's the rule and that's the way it is. There was no this long promised day that has come where God has finally decided to stop being racist. Like, that's not a thing. That's not a thing. This decision specifically reminds me very distinctly of when they had to drop shit in order to get statehood, where they had to give up polygamy and give up things in order to be granted their statehood because they know they're not going to be able to hold both of those things at the same time. One of them's got to give. They're not going to be able to maintain positive public perception while still having to constantly contend in the media with the fact that they are racist towards Black people. Like, they can't have both. Yeah. So it's like, oh, we'll drop the conditions of membership and not necessarily anything else. We won't apologize for the racism. We won't correct anything. We won't tell members to just stop being racist. Because remember, you have an institution of people who belong to this and believed that. And then the prophet says, no, wait, we're not doing that anymore. You think they're just going to be like, okay. No. They are also deeply racist.
Right.
Not every single one of them, because just like with any movement, there were people who advocated against this. And there were Mormons who advocated for the laws and things, like especially around Black members to change. And if I had time, I would go into all of those people. There's generally always people who resist those things. But by and large, members did not have a problem with this. And so that's not going to change going into the next few years, if that makes sense.
As we continue to note changes in public perception and its impact on politics with regards to the Mormon Church, we have to talk about the prophet who succeeded Spencer W. Kimball, who made that decree, proclamation, whatever. That was Gordon B. Hinckley, who was actually the prophet for most of our childhood. Hinckley had spent years working in the church's public relations department, which uniquely set him up to be prophet.
I didn't know that.
I didn't know that he worked in public relations.
Lots of time the prophets do work for the church.
Yeah.
But public relations is really nice for this instance right now, at that time. Mormon prophets were generally not open with journalists. Like, it was not a common phenomenon for people to sit down, for Mormon leadership to sit down with journalists. That was not a thing that happened. So Gordon B. Hinckley was really a shift in kind of how prophets behaved, because from the time that he began his tenure as prophet and president of the church, he had a very positive relationship with journalists. Most notably, what some people remember is he sat down for a solo interview in 1996 with 60 Minutes, which was pretty big at the time. He was the first prophet in the church history to agree to do anything like that. And he was asked hard-hitting questions, just like the Osmonds were before him, about racism, and gave lukewarm, coated with denial answers. But generally speaking, from what I've read, was well-received because of his kind of warmth and openness and genuineness.
From 1830 to 1978, blacks could not become priests in the Mormon Church, right?
That's correct.
Why?
Because the leaders of the church at that time interpreted that doctrine that way.
He's just like, when you think of like a very kind, old, cute old man, like that was his vibe. He kind of exuded that. So in 1998, he actually spoke by invitation. Again, we're trying to rehab image here, at the NAACP convention in Salt Lake, and offered to help NAACP members so that their genealogists could have access to the vast Mormon database of genealogy. It was actually a project that he took on, and they actually fulfilled it. So the relationship with the NAACP is one aspect where Mormons really tend to grab onto in proving that Mormons aren't racist. Like even recently, like even in recent years, we've got connections between the NAACP and Mormons. And in General Conference in 2006, he told church members that members who made disparaging remarks about race should not consider themselves disciples of Christ. So this is what I was just talking about when you have, like, you get rid of the policy, but you don't get rid of the people who still believe the underlying bullshit that justified the policy, right? And so he was not liking the fact that Mormons were not catching on to this shift, and explicitly told members that disparaging racist remarks were not tolerated, and you can't call yourself like a disciple of Christ when saying them, which I love on one hand, but on the other, like, we can't deny all the stuff within Mormonism that exists that is still like very racist. And so it almost sometimes feels like it's not doing much, right? Because like everything else kind of points to it and leads to it and is built on it. And so until we like kind of take accountability and shift those things, it kind of feels like it's kind of not great in practice. Yeah.
Especially when you have to overlook your own scripture, man. You essentially committed blood libel, or the equivalent of blood libel, against the indigenous people of America by painting them as your Lamanites in the Book of Mormon, who were murderous, just absolutely bloodthirsty, disgusting humans that exterminated the race of God's people in the Americas. Like, crazy work, but whatever. Ezra Taft Benson became prophet in 1985, and he was notoriously sexist, homophobic, and racist, just like the majority of his predecessors. He was previously an apostle, and said some very ridiculous, unhinged things about the civil rights movement in 1965. Notably, he said, "What are we doing to fight it? Before I left Europe, I warned how the communists were using the civil rights movement to promote revolution and eventual takeover of this country. When are we going to wake up? What do you know about the dangerous civil rights agitation in Mississippi?"
This is one quote of many that I could have pulled on him. If you change some of these
fucking nouns around, you couldn't convince me that this was said in 1965. You could very easily convince me.
I want people to see the connection between how just purely Republican Mormonism is, from the top all the way down. Like, we literally just change some verbiage, change some words, and it's the same shit, different day that's happening in our present day society right now. Like, the difference is, I mean, it's just the same. And so Mormonism is just like a perfect little puzzle piece that fit into being a Republican and conservatism. This is like one of like 1,000 quotes that I could have pulled on Ezra Taft Benson. He is like, has a communism phobia, socialism phobia, like every phobic thing that is bad that you could possibly imagine. He checks that box. Like, just overall not great dude, and had people perceiving that, especially members, that the civil rights movement was something that the church stood against, as seen with this most recent example.
Even to the point where it was causing like mass hysteria in Salt Lake City at the time. And I mean, they were in Salt Lake City. Most of the people are white there, and they're panicking about the civil rights movement that's going on across the Mississippi, which is just wild. In 2006, the church benefited from a multi-part PBS documentary entitled The Mormons, which is very...
So that brings us to 2008. And if you're an ex-Mormon, or you were around at the time, you probably remember Proposition 8. If you are not from here, if you are new to us, you are unfamiliar. But if you've been around, you've probably heard us mention Prop 8 like a million times. So if you're not from around here, Proposition 8 happened in California specifically, and it was a constitutional amendment intended to ban same-sex marriage. Now, what the hell does this have to do with Mormons? Well, because it was a Mormon cause, they decided they were going to jump in head first and involve themselves.
And I mean, we already set this up. They had those fucking ads. What were they called? The Homefront ads in the night, all the way dating back to the 70s. So Mormons, traditional marriage,
traditional
homosexuality, bad. Heterosexuality, good. That's the Mormons. That's not me. But so it makes a lot of sense that they were taking up their cause. And this was a schism for a lot of people. You talk to ex-Mormons today. This was a big turning point for a lot of people because of the implications and what they were asking members to do. There was a letter that was sent out in June of 2008, and it reads,
in March 2000, California voters overwhelmingly approved a state law providing that only marriage between a man and a woman is valid or recognized in California. The California Supreme Court recently reversed the vote of the people. On November 4th, 2008, Californians will vote on a proposed amendment of the California State Constitution that will now restore the March 2000 definition of marriage approved by the voters. The church's teachings and position on this moral issue are unequivocal. Marriage between a man and a woman is ordained of God, and the formation of families is central to the Creator's plan for his children. Children are entitled to be born within this bond of marriage. A broad-based coalition of churches and other organizations placed the proposed amendment on the ballot. The church will participate with this coalition in seeking its passage. Local church leaders will provide information about how you may become involved in this important cause. We ask that you do all you can to support the proposed constitutional amendment by donating of your means and time to assure that marriage in California is legally defined as being between a man and a woman. Our best efforts are required to preserve the sacred institution of marriage. Yeah, where's that church and state separation?
Yeah. Obviously, there are some very common ways that people contribute to campaigns of this nature. A lot of the local leaders, just from experiences that have been told to us by people who lived in California at the time, a lot of the local leaders were urging people to go out and door knock. I remember Alan Mount specifically saying that they were during Sunday school given stacks of flyers, and they were going out and canvassing and giving these flyers out. People were also making signs that, promoted the church's stance on Prop 8, encouraging to give donations and
time,
things of
volunteer
that
energy.
Nature. Even the church donated money that it had from tithes and other sources of income that ultimately came from tithes, over $190,000, which Jeff Holland very famously said that they did not give 1 red cent to supporting, but there was a whole lot of red pennies in that $190,000 that they did donate in campaigning. In total, according to The Atlantic, Mormons contributed over $20 million to the passing of this proposition, and almost half of that came from Utah alone, outside of the state.
Yeah, not even California.
So they weren't just, we heard about it here in Colorado. They weren't just talking about it in California. They were talking about it all over because it was like this moral panic. We can't let the homosexuals marry. We can't let any other genders
everywhere else
get that same privilege that we have.
Half the donations that they received came from Mormons. Like, of all the donations. Like,
oh, okay.
This is wild to me. That of all the people that were donating to this thing, half of them were Mormon, and 90% of the people canvassing, like McKay just referenced, were also Mormon. So this was just like taken up as like almost a 100% Mormon cause.
Yeah. The church was fined $5,000 2 weeks before the election due to failing to follow campaign disclosure policies, due to $37,000 in non-monetary contribution. How did they arrive at that number? I have no clue.
And they don't care about $5,000. And they weren't the only ones. Mormons were one of many other religious organizations that rallied around Prop 8. Some of them that you will, if you are in the Fundiverse, you will recognize Focus on the Family.
Colorado's
also
own.
campaigned for this. Various evangelical Christian groups, the Roman Catholic Church, of course, the Church of Scientology, the American Family Association, the Eastern Orthodox Church, and the Orthodox Union. So your very conservative, gay marriage bashing religions rallied behind Prop 8.
Scientology? What is
Scientology?
What does Xenu have to do with the
They're
Pink Pony
actually
Club? What the
homophobic.
hell? What the
They're actually homophobic, which was surprising to me given the celebrity endorsements.
Though Prop 8 passed, it was later overturned and ruled unconstitutional by a federal court. So that's a win for love, obviously.
Oh my God. They were
bet they were up in
destroyed,
fucking arms.
devastated, because they got what they wanted, and then ultimately, in the years that passed, it got tossed
didn't
out
matter.
for being unconstitutional.
All that effort.
All that money, all that
For
effort
nothing.
was a waste. So, yay for the gays. In 2012, we have to talk about 2012. If you're familiar with politics, do you know what I'm about to say?
I feel like everybody who is watching right now was there for 2012. If you weren't there, you might need to hold off on this.
I feel like 2012 was a time in politics where there was still civility. I remember watching those debates. I remember this, despite the fact that Obama and Mitt absolutely detested each other, that they were still civil in debates. And I still remember that. And that is quite the fucking contrast to where we are today. So 2012 comes around and Mormonism gets thrust into the national spotlight in a way that they never really had been, because previous presidential campaigns just did not garner this energy, because Mitt Romney, son of George Romney, decided to run for president. So like I said, Mitt Romney is George Romney's son, so we've got a little bit of a political dynasty going on. And his mom also ran for Senate, though unsuccessfully. Some interesting things about that.
So really, their dynasty is losing elections.
Yes.
Am I right?
Unfortunately, kind of. So Mitt is not a terrible Republican, in my opinion. He's not. I feel like Mitt does not fit the mold of horrific
Terrible
Republicans
Republican.
today.
That sounds redundant.
He actually has, so like, I'm talking about, like, you know, Republicans that lack intelligence. Lauren Boebert comes to mind. So Mitt went to BYU, and then he went to Harvard for grad school to get his Juris Doctorate and his MBA. And then I included this just because I think it's kind of gross and what a weird connection. But after graduating, he worked for some place called Boston Consulting Group, which was where Benjamin Netanyahu was working at the time. And they were colleagues, and they actually became friends.
That's wild.
Isn't that crazy? So Mitt was heavily involved with the church. This was not a casual member running for office. Mitt was a bishop, a seminary teacher, various other small callings, and even stake president. So he was top of the line when it came to involvement in Mormonism. And he had a political career prior to running for president. He ran for Senate, unfortunately, and lost in Massachusetts, if I remember correctly. And also was governor of Massachusetts. Those states might be different. I believe he was governor of Massachusetts. So he won governor, and then he decided to run for president. And that's where we are here, timeline-wise, in 2012.
But he ran in 2008. He didn't get the nomination, right?
I
remember hearing about him in 2008.
I think so. This was, so I found this article as like a thesis that somebody did, I think, at like BYU.
Okay.
So if you're interested in it, I will link it. But, you know, not like well studied, just somebody's observations from a thesis.
But they said that it seemed the most common sentiments related to Romney's religion during his campaign included that Mormons had strange beliefs, which, I mean...
That tracks.
That tracks. Mormons are not Christians, and that Mormons were racist. Coincidentally or not, the church was running their I'm a Mormon campaign beginning in 2010. That was a marketing campaign designed to dispel misconceptions and educate people about the members of the church.
And if this is a big brain move, which Mormonism tends to make big brain moves when it comes to marketing and public relations, okay? If Mitt decided he was officially going to run, and if he thought that the RNC would get behind him and he had a legitimate chance this time around in 2012, wouldn't it make sense that the church take a proactive approach to marketing that was very in your face? The I'm a Mormon campaign was all about profiles of like celebrity Mormons and famous Mormons and just your average Mormons on TV and a whole documentary and a whole thing to like essentially like top it off in terms of rehabbing the Mormon image. Okay. Like the other stereotypical stuff about Mormons came in via the internet, which they're kind of combating at this point. But wouldn't it make sense to have a very excellent, well-done marketing campaign right before Mitt Romney runs for president? Like, it just makes sense. There's 2 interviews. I wanted to include, I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to include this because it is technically media, and we might get copyrighted for this.
BBC will definitely get a copyright.
This is the video that I pulled is an interview with, like, the Nemo did, where he included the BBC clips.
Okay.
So I'm hoping... There's 2 interviews that I think are fascinating. I want you to see a little bit about how Mitt talked about Mormonism when he was confronted in interviews about Mormonism. And then I also wanted you to see the church leaders' responses when he was running for president. Because the BBC, during the time that Mitt was running, came out swinging. Like, not just, hey, Mormons do weird shit. It was, hey, talk to me about the temple penalties.
Ooh.
And Jeffrey Holland, who was a church leader at the time, did not take kindly to that. And it was, I distinctly remember this interview and being kind of taken aback by how agitated that Jeffrey Holland got during this interview, because the whole thing of it was like, the Mormon church doesn't usually do interviews, and we get like a top secret interview with a Mormon leader. And I don't know how they decided it was Jeffrey. Maybe because he's educated and he's a good speaker.
Yeah.
I don't know. But it was very controversial, and they asked very hard-hitting questions. So I wanted to include both of those things so you could kind of get a picture of media at the time, because Mitt was not taken kindly to. Like, I think he eventually got to a point where it was kind of taken in stride and kind of funny, like, it's the Mormon guy. But, like, a lot of people legitimately, it's brought up in one of these interviews that was like, people say they're not going to vote for you because you're Mormon. Like, it's legitimately a sticking point that people were not comfortable with. Sound off in the comments if you were of voting age at the time. I'm curious. I was not.
You've come to Washington to try and win the votes of these conservative Christian evangelicals. In light of that, is it fair to ask you about your faith? I mean, I'm wondering, how much about his faith do you think a candidate is obligated to share with voters?
You can ask anything you'd like. I don't feel bad at all about people asking me about my faith. I think it's natural. Most people don't know very much about it, and so if they want to ask questions, I'm happy to respond. If they have questions about the doctrines of my church, I typically direct them to the church, because they could probably do a better job explaining than I can. But in terms of my values, what I think about the future of the country, how my faith impacts my thoughts about important issues, then I'm of course open to all those topics.
Well, let me just, for example, rightly or wrongly, a Newsweek poll says that 28% of the people they polled said they would not vote for a Mormon. Now, I know your staff has said that's irrelevant because they should be asked would they vote for you. But do you feel compelled to explain your religion or your relationship to it, or is that something that ought to be out of bounds?
No, I'm happy to have people ask questions. That doesn't bother me. And I think the reason that some 29% are not comfortable voting for a Mormon is they think they're voting for Harry Reid. But that's not the case. I think as people say, would you vote for Mitt Romney? And they get to know me and my wife and my family, they realize that our values are as American as any values you'll find in the country.
Despite all of his efforts, and despite, getting the nomination from the RNC, doing all the work, campaigning, Mitt did not have a clear path to 270, and Barack Obama won the election.
As the story goes.
However, he went on to have a successful political career, in my opinion, in Utah, because he would go on to run for Utah Senate, and he won in 2018. And he is currently still in office right now, and announced because of events that we'll get to in a minute, announced that 2025 he will retire at the end of his term, which is upcoming next year. Yes. 2016. Are we ready?
A new bombshell has entered the villa.
A new bombshell has entered the villa, and it is not one that we want.
So in 2016, obviously, Donald Trump comes onto the scene. And I mean, comes onto the scene is really kind of reductive, because he had been around before Mitt Romney had even run. People were throwing out there that Donald Trump should run in like 2008. And so he was finally on the scene in an active capacity, and he's running for president in 2016. Though Donald Trump was running as a Republican, he immediately began to hit barriers with Mormon voters. One of them being his campaigning on the Muslim ban, which would have banned all Muslims from entering the United States.
And he talked about this. If you remember 2016, he talked about that on the campaign trail often. It was not something that came up here and there. It was a cornerstone of the things that he was talking about when he was running.
Unfortunately for me, most of this is blacked out because I was in an information black hole known as a full-time mission. So I really did not hear about a lot of this shit until after. If you've been with us since the beginning of the video, you'll know exactly why this is unsettling for Mormons. Singling out people of a certain faith is bringing up some generational trauma. Obviously, not a good look for Donald J. Trump when you're looking at it through the Mormon lens.
Additionally, Trump's businessman, not a politician persona often came off as crass, and his language was fairly vulgar, which is often too much for most Mormons who are going to tend to stray away from off-color humor and swearing. The majority of Mormons don't swear, but maybe here and there. And so his overall kind of vulgar, crass personality was kind of conflicting with the Mormon kind of general personality. And his inappropriate and offensive comments towards a variety of people, but specifically Hispanic immigrants, also can't be ignored, especially since there are many Hispanic members. And another important thing to note here is frequently Mormons go on missions to Spanish-speaking countries, places in South America. So it's often something that happens that McKay can speak to, where there's often kind of a radicalization that happens when these people went to these countries, and this shouldn't have to happen in order to normalize that you shouldn't be criticizing people being racist. But for people who lived with those people for 2 years and have relationships with them, a lot of the things that he was saying about those people were offensive to Mormons.
In a quote from a Politico article from 2016 titled "Trump Hits a Mormon Wall," a voter shares a little bit of their opinion. They say, "I'm most likely to vote Trump," Christensen said, "but I won't be putting the blood, sweat, and tears like I have with Romney the last several cycles with McCain. I don't see a scenario where I do anything but vote for him."
This is a big distinction, this person highlights, between McCain and Romney, where people backed McCain and Romney Mormons
pretty solidly.
Very solidly, and you'll see that in the numbers that I'm going to share in a second. But they were not backing Trump in 2016 in the same way. This was a means to an end. I have to vote for him because he has the R next to his name. They were not passionately behind him and campaigning for him.
Trump had also gotten in his own way by insulting Romney and his religion during the GOP primary, and Romney fought back, voicing his distaste and opposition for Trump as a candidate, which we think went a long way for people who were Romney supporters. In fact, back in 2014, Trump said that it was Romney's Mormon faith that cost him the presidency in 2012, and Mormon voters did not take that kindly.
Mitt Romney became very vocal about not being a Trump supporter. And in fact, if you remember back to 2016, or if you're not from the US, a lot of Republicans were very against Donald Trump running for president. Lindsey Graham comes to mind, who is now a very passionate Trump supporter. But it's interesting because Mitt maintained that position of being against Donald Trump from that point forward, which offset a lot of people because they felt loyalty to Mitt and felt weird voting for Donald Trump when Mitt was not behind it. And then the Access Hollywood tape gets leaked. Now, if you're not from here, this was what I thought at the time, because I was barely graduated from high school. What I thought was going to be the end of the Trump campaign, which was when Access Hollywood released a tape where Trump said some very disgusting, vile, and concerning things about his feelings and his behavior towards women. And I thought that was going to be the end of it. And multiple Utah politicians withdrew their endorsement for Trump at the time because everybody pretty much thought that was going to be the end, was kind of the common sentiment. And the church-owned Deseret News broke an 80-year rule of no presidential endorsements to publish an article calling for Donald Trump to resign. Now, let's emphasize again, the Deseret News is church-owned. There's not anything that's coming through the Deseret News that hasn't at least come across the desk of church leadership, right? So even the church-owned news called him to resign based on those comments alone.
Generally speaking, the Mormon vote is pretty small, with Mormons representing something like 2% of the U.S. population. But we've talked about the Morador before, and two of those very important swing states lie in the Morador, namely Arizona and Nevada. Biden in 2020 won Arizona by a small, very, very small margin. And having the Mormons vote could be the difference in an election like that one. So, though the amount of Mormons on the whole are small, geographically they exist where it really counts, so candidates can't really afford to disenfranchise the Mormon base.
That's why I wanted to bring this up, is because people are like, there are not that many Mormons.
Yes.
Why does it freaking matter? Because there are two states where it really counts.
Yeah, and just to drive the point home, because they live in the right places. Because Mormons in Utah only are about 50% of the population. But you look at who all are the Mormons in the legislature, and they represent 75 to 85% of the legislature. So despite making up only 50% of the population, they have more legislative power. And
Idaho
all that
is similar.
Mormonism is going to take apart.
Yeah. Because people asked us about Utah and Idaho specifically. Utah and Idaho are fairly deep red. Like, Utah and Idaho are ones that you're not really going to see changes. Like, the only areas within Utah that you're going to see a blue shift is in the heart of Salt Lake City. Exactly. Because that is a predominantly, like, Democratic-led area. But it is not enough to constitute all of the electoral votes that Utah has to offer. So, some data that I wanted to include to kind of bring us up to speed with what happened the last time and where we could potentially be going. So according to the Pew Research Center, which does lots of research related to politics, Mormon support for the Republican ticket dropped from 78% in 2012 to 61% in 2016. So 78 was when Romney was running. They had 78%. And then Trump runs around in 2016 and we dropped to 61. This is also, in the context of this is fascinating because Pew Research Center talks about how lots of Christians were moving more right in this time frame. And so we've got, like, Mormons who are generally pretty far over there. But then because of this whole Donald Romney dynamic, Mormons are more hesitant, which is reflected in the data. And then another important issue to bring up in 2016 for the Trump election was a man named Evan McMullen. So Evan McMullen was a Mormon and a former CIA officer, which was a cornerstone of his campaign. And he decided to run for president as an independent in 2016. So he actually left the Republican Party after Trump became the nominee and became a very vocal critic of Trump and his campaign. So classic member, served a mission, very devoted, has callings, attended BYU. This is your very cut and dry Mormon, like works for the CIA, government jobs, love Mormons, like pretty cut and dry Mormon. So he was kind of an alternative in 2016 for the people who were uncomfortable voting with Trump, and people loved him even more because he was Mormon. Like, they had the opportunity, like in 2012, to vote for another Mormon candidate. So shockingly, Evan received 21.5% of the vote in Utah, which for an independent candidate is quite a lot.
In, like, any place, honestly.
He got 0.5% nationally. Okay, so, like...
really only popular among the Utahns.
Really only popular among the Utahns, but that's why the Utah vote was so incredibly split for Donald in 2016, was because Evan pulled over 20% of that vote, which is fascinating.
And now, a message from the only sovereign recognized by this channel, King James.
Howdy, Jordan and McKay. King James here of Fundy Fridays. Thank you all so much for inviting me on for a little guest segment here. You know how much I love Mormon political taxonomy. Oh, and also, congratulations on 100,000 subs and that fancy silver play button of yours. You two have been so instrumental in the development of a safe, positive space for ex-Mormons online and hell, for the whole religious deconstruction community at large. Jen and I are so frickin' proud of you two. We're so happy to see you finally get the recognition you deserve, and we cannot wait to see where you all go from here. Anyway, though, enough of the sap. Let's get to the yap. Alright, so just for you all watching at home, Jordan and McKay sent me 3 little questions that they wanted me to cover. I'm kind of doing this off the cuff. A lot of my opinion. If there's something I can cite as a fact, I'll try and put it up. But this is mostly just me riffing on my outsider opinions, thoughts, ideas, views of the Republican-Utah Mormon relationship. So, question 1. Mormons started out extremely wary and hesitant, and some even outright refused to vote for Trump back in 2016. He won Utah with a plurality at 45% of the vote, although he lost 21% of the vote to an independent conservative Mormon candidate named Evan McMullen. And furthermore, that all compares pretty badly to Mitt Romney, who secured over 70% of Utah in the presidential race of 2012. So Jordan and McKay asked me, what are your thoughts on how Utah voters responded to Trump's candidacy in 2016 and then subsequently 2020? He did increase his margins in Utah in 2020 from 45% to 54%. Any thoughts on why there would be an increase or shift? Does it have to do with the MAGA nonsense and people eventually embracing Trump culture, or another explanation? Which I could obviously say is a great question, although they're all from Jordan and McKay, so they're all great questions. And that is to say that, first of all, there is a ton of interesting ground to cover in the relationship between Donald Trump and Utah/the Mormons. And let me say it just right off the top to get us started, Trump's relationship to Utah, it is his relationship to the Mormons. Now, I know on this channel that might seem kind of obvious, but I want it laid out from the beginning. Mormonism's full-strength stranglehold on Utah life, politics, and culture, well, it's fully unique within our country right now. While a lot of other American states are religious, deeply religious even, no other American state is so uniquely singularly controlled by one religious organization the way Utah is controlled by the Latter-day Saints. Likewise, Utah Mormons are, for lack of better phrasing, the Mormiest Mormons. They're the trendsetters, the standard bearers, hell, the culture leaders for global Mormon culture, but especially for American Mormon culture. As such, we can use Utah's presidential and political poll numbers to not only check in on any given candidate's relationship with the state, but also more broadly that candidate's relationship with the entire Mormon church at large. Now, on the broadest scale, I think it's fascinating just to see what is arguably the most modernized American religion, Mormonism, and then to see how it interacts with a presidential candidate who has completely redefined what it means to be a presidential candidate in the modern era in Donald Trump. Because from the outside, at least, it seems like Mormonism's history within the United States, well, it's primarily been told through a series of desperate attempts at assimilation. Mormons, more than anything else on the planet, just want to be seen as normal. Individual Mormons seem to pride themselves on keeping their head down in quiet contributions to the greater good of the church, and even in staying on top of various social and cultural trends just so they don't seem obtuse or disconnected from the community, God forbid. These are not a people who like to stand out or rock the boat, and they're certainly not usually the type of folks you would think of being involved in broader efforts at social reform. Likewise, the LDS Church itself has spent over a century now trying to get itself taken as seriously as the more established Abrahamic religions. And as part of that never-ending quest for legitimacy, it seems they've found a model for success in the hyper-politicized world of American evangelical Christianity. Like any good evangelical megachurch empire, the LDS collects an absurd amount of money, a must for any capitalist religion. They impose rigidly conservative morals and standards on their congregation. And perhaps most importantly, Utah itself has cultivated a long history with the American Republican Party. And perhaps nowhere is this better reflected than in the presidential politics of Utah. which has actually voted for the Republican candidate going all the way back to 1964. And even then, it took historically unpopular Republican candidate Barry Goldwater to finally push them to vote for a Democrat, namely LBJ. And then before that, you have to go all the way back to 1948 when Utah did manage to get itself to vote for Harry Truman. So yeah, Utah loves Republicans, and very particularly, they love picking them for president. Likely influenced in no small part by the state's overall influence from Mormon culture. Now, at least up until 2016, this was a match made in heaven, or I guess the celestial kingdom for the sake of this episode. But for real, both organizations stood for the advancement of wealthy white men, the subjugation of basically everybody else, and also for the use of rigid, morality-driven social repression as a means of preserving that status quo. This partnership was so well matched that in 2012, the Mormons got to send their own candidate for president in the form of Mitt Romney, chosen in destiny to both win the presidency for the Republicans and the hearts of the American people for the Mormons.
I accept your nomination for President of the United States.
And boy oh boy did Mitt Romney ever Mormon up the American presidential process, playing the gentlest, most middling kind of conservative imaginable, especially by today's standards, while also leaning into his own admittedly graceful yet uniquely boring milquetoast Mormon public persona. And for a while, it almost seemed like it would work too. But as we all know now, it didn't work. And in Mitt's failure in 2012 to secure the presidency for the Republican Party, I also think we kinda saw the death of his brand of LDS-inspired conservatism as well. I think national conservatives were mad at the Mormon conservatives, specifically for screwing up the 2012 election with their stupid Mitt Romney and his bland, boring, economy-driven brand of conservatism. And I personally think that all of that drove the national GOP voter base towards the vicious, vitriolic, tantrum-prone Donald Trump in 2016. Mitt's inoffensive, deferential, wait-your-turn brand of conservative politics hadn't done what they'd wanted it to. So instead, they went the complete opposite direction, and chose a brash, bigoted bulldozer who reflected their own collective deteriorating mental state. But the thing is, Donald Trump represents an aggression, a kind of crudeness that traditionally, at least from an outsider's perspective, doesn't really mesh well with Mormon culture. Mormons are nice, at least to outsiders. They accomplish their goals with cooperation, and by winning over those who might not otherwise agree with their faith and/or worldview. Donald Trump is a cruelty-driven bully who doesn't care about anyone and doesn't compromise at all. That's why Mormon fringe candidate Evan McMullin pulled over 20% of the conservative vote in Utah in 2016, I think, because a lot of Mormons liked Mitt's approach to conservatism and didn't want it replaced, let alone with Trumpism. And yet, because Trump was the Republican candidate, voting for him in 2016 was still the Mormon assimilationist thing to do overall, leading to his pluralist 45% victory margin.
This is very exciting for me. I know so many people that are in your church and the Latter-day Saints. The job you've done is beyond anything you can think of.
Now, Trump's increase from 45% of the overall Utah vote in 2016 to 55% in 2020 may look like a big victory on the Mormon front for him. But personally, I actually see that as a bit of a bad stat for Trump since there were no Mormon-friendly alternatives on the ballot that year like Evan McMullin. Had Trump's presidency not been a complete dumpster fire, I would have expected him to pull in all of that 20% that Evan McMullin got in 2016. Which, if you're keeping up with the math, would have put him at 65% of the overall vote for the state of Utah. Instead, though, that additional 10% seems to have instead split for Biden, whose 37% portion of the Utah vote in 2020 was actually an increase over Hillary Clinton's 27% in 2016. Now, that may fool you into believing that the Mormons are willing to let cooler heads prevail and potentially even not vote for the Red Hat Maniac, but I would not get your hopes up. Trump still got a majority victory in Utah in 2020. And Mitt Romney's popularity seems to be tabling off or even decreasing as his time in politics comes to an end. Meanwhile, Trump-aligned Utah senior Senator Mike Lee, who up until recently seemed to just live in Mitt's shadow, well, he's found his career doing better than ever now that he's bent the knee to the American far right. Likewise, and this is just James pontificating a little bit here, but I just have a gut feeling that Mormon culture's about to get a lot rowdier over the next few years. Now, to be fair, I base a lot of that opinion on television. But between the unhinged cultural phenomenon that is the Real Housewives of Salt Lake City, Cody Brown's turn towards incel-driven anti-feminism on Sister Wives, and the Mormon-owned Angel Studios' ascent to the top of American Christian media, I see the Mormons becoming more Trumpy over time, and in turn, I sadly think that Trumpism is a perfect fit for this Mormon cultural shift. Utah is just far too enmeshed with the GOP at this point to really actually choose a Democrat for president. So I think they're gonna keep picking Trump, and whatever Trump-alikes come after him no matter what. And in turn, for a state and a congregation who have spent so much of their lives going along to get along, turning the other cheek in the face of broader American distrust, well, I can't imagine how good it feels for all these Mormons to be the political bullies for once. So all of that is just a lot of words to say that I have this gut feeling that Mormonism, and especially Utah, are only going to get Trumpier over time. Next question. What are your thoughts on Mitt Romney's candidacy for president and or his evolution to the politician he is today? If you remember, as a non-Mormon, what were your perceptions of Mitt and Mormonism when he was running? Truly, in another timeline, I think Mitt managed to get over that saying 47% of Americans are lazy and vote for Democrats for free stuff thing, and would go on to take the presidency in 2012. In another timeline. People forget that for much of that 2012 race, Mitt Romney seemed not only like a very feasible presidential candidate, but a likely one. Likewise, and especially in the age of Trump, it can be almost surreal to recall Mitt Romney's approach to Republican presidential politics. Romney seemed to prioritize bipartisanship and went pretty far out of his way to avoid vilifying Democrats, or really vilifying anyone at all. He was a handsome charmer, but also a hyper-pious family man without so much as a whiff of a sex scandal. He worked hard to cultivate broad appeal and gravitas even in the face of his own fringe religious views. As an Obama liberal at that point in my life, I remember thinking of Romney more than anything as a strategic irritant. I wanted Barack Obama to get a second term, and I felt like Mitt Romney was a very good choice by the GOP that had a strong chance of preventing said second Obama term. And I do also recall being worried about a Romney victory from a fiscal perspective, but also being kind of hopeful that he might be workable on certain social issues. Things like gay marriage, prison reform, or Lord, even abortion at that point. I was a hopeful young voter. Now, arguably, I think Mitt Romney did an incredible job of raising the status of the Mormon Church in my family's eyes. I recall that both of my grandparents, deep red conservatives for most of their lives, and certainly by 2012, well, they would actively defend Mitt's Mormon faith. My grandfather, who I love but also once very particularly told me that Mormons are weird and worship a snake god, well, he was now proud to see his party embracing religious diversity. My grandmother compared people judging Mitt Romney for his Mormon faith to people judging JFK for his Catholic faith, and insisting that it was wrong for either of them to be judged on those things. No, instead, my grandparents didn't like Mitt Romney because he was soft. They said he was basically a Democrat with how happy he was to compromise with them. And I recall my grandfather said that while he did plan to vote for Mitt Romney, he also nonetheless felt that a Romney presidency would be, and I quote, the death of the Republican Party, and that he planned to vote Libertarian in any presidential elections after that. And not coincidentally, in my opinion, both of them were staunch Trump supporters in 2016 and 2020. And it also doesn't surprise me that Mitt Romney fell into that kind of cooler head elder statesman role later in life for the GOP. As the last pre-Trump Republican presidential candidate, it seemed only right that he held up the flag for the old guard even as the ship sank around him. I think Romney's brand of conservatism has its strengths and weaknesses, especially compared to Trumpism. While it's generally less offensive and brutalist than Trumpism, Mitt's approach to governing still relies on slashing taxes, privatizing everything, and allowing the top 1% of America's wealthiest citizens to hoard as much as they want for as long as they want. furthermore, Mitt's ability to play nice and glad hand the way he does, well, it opens up more opportunities for him and other hardline fiscal conservatives like him to sneak tax cuts, misappropriations, and other obtuse yet nefarious financial legislation into our law in such a way that they can sneakily divert even more money to that top 1%. That being said, I can't help but feel like Mitt Romney was still much more workable on certain social issues than modern Trump Republicans are. While Mitt Romney would have certainly screwed over most of America with terrible economic policy, I do think that he and his kind of conservatives might be a little more open to engaging with ideas like systemic racism, gender oppression, queer equality, so forth and so on. I know, I'm very hopeful. It gets me into trouble a lot. Anyway, last question. What do you find interesting or confusing or unique about the Mormon voting bloc? They account for like 2% of the US population, but can make a big difference in states like Nevada and Arizona. So, even despite that lead-in, I have to say, first and foremost, the most unique and interesting thing about Mormon politics in the United States is, and I think always will be, Utah itself. In having to directly appeal to one fringe religion to win one state, well, Utah has made it so they'll always be at least somewhat unique on the American electoral landscape. Iowa always gets the primaries first, and in order to win Utah, you have to get the Mormons. Now, of course, all of that is really only interesting if said fringe religious movement has interesting political views or challenges candidates in any unique ways. But sadly, at least from an outsider's political perspective, the Mormon voting bloc looks like little more than a rubber stamp extension of the Republican Party. It's basically a smaller, less impactful version of the massive evangelical voting bloc we all know and dread. And just like with the evangelicals, it seems that the party's shift towards Trumpism has done little, if anything, to deter the Mormons' faith in the Republican Party at large. Sure, it's a good thing that Biden picked up 10% more of the electoral vote in Utah in 2020 than Hillary did, but Trump still took the majority, and that is all you could ever need to win Utah. And the lion's share of conservative Mormons, which let's be honest is most Mormons, well, they clearly seem to be embracing far-right ideology en masse. So we have no reason to believe any of this will change anytime soon. Nevada and Arizona are much more interesting, though. Both states have shown themselves to be swingy at the presidential level for the past few election cycles now, with narrow margins and more recent histories of picking across party lines than, say, somewhere like Utah. In states like that, personally, I think it comes down to finding pockets of a particular population. If you know a lot of Mormons live in a particular Nevada or Arizona county, for example, and you can drive a lot of them to either vote for you when they weren't voting at all, or to flip their vote from whoever the other candidate is to you, well, you could maybe have a chance to use that to swing some close elections. And likewise, these same population pockets can be used much more easily to advance a local candidate than they can to contribute to anything as high as a presidential or a senatorial election. Planting a Mormon candidate for, say, comptroller or sheriff, something like that, well, in one of these areas, that could end up creating a big swing in the votes, and thus might be a very effective way to win elections on a smaller, localized scale. And bear in mind, as we saw with Evan McMullin in 2016, this doesn't have to be a Trumper thing either. Maybe a less deranged Republican who just so happens to be Mormon could sneak away a nomination from a far-right maniac. Or maybe even, under the right circumstances, a Mormon Democrat could pull off a surprise victory. Not completely feasible, at least, just very unlikely. But anyway, I hope all of that gives you a good perspective from the never-mo side of things. So anyway, thank you once again, Jordan and McKay, for letting me take part in this little discussion. I hope I've given you a good overview of the never-mo side of Mormon politics, Utah, and beyond. And now, back to your favorite apostates.
And Trump still won. Utah has 6 electoral votes. He won all of them with 45% of the vote. Now, compared to Mitt's run for president 4 years prior, he won 72.79% of the vote in 2012. So we went from 72, almost 73, to 45. That's a crazy drop.
Huge.
That is a crazy drop. And I wanted to bring that up to illustrate Mormons did not ride for Donald Trump in the beginning. They did not. It was not like they were uncomfortable with it. They didn't like it. Plenty of Mormons, like in our circles, talked about it. Like, people were not fans. Mormons were not fans of Donald in the beginning. He was also able to win Arizona's electoral votes, possibly connecting with the voters that were determined to vote Republican no matter what. And then he would go on to secure the votes needed to be the 45th president of the United States, unfortunately for everyone.
The church demonstrated that though they don't explicitly endorse candidates, they do associate with conservative politics. In January 2017, Apostle Quentin Cook attended the Seymour Institute Seminary on Religious Freedom. According to Joanna Brooks, who we've been referencing throughout this episode, the institute is based at the Ella Baker House in Boston and funded by the Witherspoon Institute, a conservative think tank that also funded the controversial Regeneris study in 2012, which alleged the insufficiency of LGBTQ plus parenting and was cited as evidence in unsuccessful legal cases against same-sex marriage. The Mormon Church was the only major religious institution besides the Church of God in Christ to be represented on the program. Who?
Right. They are also extremely homophobic. This is what I mean when I say that the church might not explicitly endorse candidates, but then they do this. Like, we have a conservative think tank that is paying extensive amounts of money to create a study that says that LGBTQ parents do not parent as good as opposite sex parents, to be used in case studies and to be used in legal and lawful cases that are coming before important things like government and the Supreme Court, even though they were unsuccessful. And the church is there.
They're like, yeah,
supporting that.
Let's do it.
With only one other extremely homophobic church that's also there.
Whatevs.
Anyway, I just wanted to illustrate that point for you. So, going back to data, we have 2020 rolls around and Trump is running again. If you're not from the United States, Trump's running again. And then we have Biden-Harris as his opponents. And in 2020, Trump increases his margin in Utah, winning the state with 58% of the vote compared to 45% in 2016. So that is a fairly substantial increase. He did lose his lead in Arizona, losing the state's electoral votes to Biden by a slim margin, like we mentioned. So Arizona did flip blue the last election. But the increase from 45 to 58 is interesting because to me, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts in the comments as well, there is something that happened in between those 4 years.
There was no McMullen.
I
think
that's a big part of it.
Is a huge part.
However, Mormons started to become kind of more okay with Trump as an idea, and even some kind of began to firmly embrace him. He kind of aligns, like, it's another video in and of itself, but Trump kind of attracts a certain kind of extremism in a Mormon voter, unfortunately. Not all of them, but some of them. And so there's something within that culture, and there's something that happened in America during this time frame where it, instead of it just being like we vote for a political candidate, Trumpism, I call it Trumpism, other people do as well. It's kind of like it's larger than a political campaign at this point. Like, it almost feels like a lifestyle to people. Like, you know, when in America prior to this election did I see anybody flying a flag with a presidential candidate's name on it in their front yard? Never. Now I have that on my street. Like,
right.
There's just
not just that. That is like really downplaying.
Yeah.
With a presidential campaign or a presidential candidate who is depicted like Rambo with 2 M60 machine guns on the front of an American flag flying above their home.
Yeah.
I shit you not, I saw this several times in Utah.
So weird. Like it went from being hesitant,
insane,
to just like balls deep embracing it. Like, not even like hesitation anymore. It's like, can I get him tattooed on my forehead when he gets his ear blown off? You know, like what? Like, it's weird. So he kind of restored that lead, and there wasn't an independent candidate that was running at the time. So maybe that played a role in it as well. But I think that's important to mention. It's also important to mention that one of the church's top leaders, who was actually I believe he was in the first presidency at the time, got in trouble because back when Mitt Romney was campaigning, like around that same time, the Mormon church decided that church leadership, like senior church leaders, like apostles, the big boys, weren't allowed to donate to political campaigns for whatever reason they saw. I mean, I see it as a marketing thing and a public relations issue. But they weren't so these leaders aren't allowed to donate to political campaigns. And if you didn't know, I don't know if it's like this other places, but in the US, there's like one giant system where you can look up everybody's political contribution. Yours, mine, your neighbors, celebrities, you can look up anybody to see if they've donated to political campaigns because all of that information is public. So some journalist worth their salt was doing some Googling and utilized this search system, apparently, or somebody did, and found that Dieter Uchtdorf, who is one of the apostles, had voted for various Democratic candidates and Joe Biden. When it's basically assumed
has not been
that you're going to be voting for the Republican. It was not taken very well by the other leaders. And there was some articles that were written and he had to make a formal statement. And I don't know if he apologized. I think he apologized, but he said something along the lines of oh, it's my family's account. And because my family did it, my name was attached to it. And that's what happened. It's a total bullshit lie. I 100% believe that man votes Democrat, but because of the publicity that came from that, he had to lie and backtrack.
Which is common with them.
Which is also unfortunate because this just goes to show that Mormons can't tolerate people who don't vote Republican anymore so much that they're going to shame their leaders, and people were upset with him. And even though we don't know if this is the exact reason, but he got demoted.
Yeah.
So I hesitate to believe that was not part of it.
During the 2020 campaign, we did see a smaller group of Mormons voting for Biden under a Latter-day Saints for Biden movement. This group consisted of some Republicans uncomfortable with voting for Trump again or for the first time, some independents, and some of the minority group of Mormons who tend to vote Democrat. Despite being the minority, one study found that of the members under 40 that they surveyed, over half had voted for Biden in the 2020 election. This seems to represent a trend of younger Mormon voters not tending to vote Republican as a default compared to their older counterparts, our parents and their parents and so on. Part of that data reported Mormons of color were more likely to vote for Biden. Within Mormonism, in our experience, there has always been a pretty small subset of members who lean left or tend to vote Democrat or independent. At the time, that was us. And it was pretty upsetting to some of our close relationships.
One of the most fascinating aspects of data that I want to bring up, there was no gender gap in voting in 2020 between Trump and Biden in this data set among members that we're talking about. So Mormon women showed up for Trump at 65% compared to Mormon men at 66%. So this brings up a question that we've been asked before is, do Mormon women feel like they have to vote for who their husband is voting for? And I would say that this data probably reflects some of that, and possibly also reflects that Mormon women hold these same opinions in regards to reproductive rights, even though it ultimately negatively impacts them. Sexism still thrives within Mormonism. That's not new for anyone. And even though women are ultimately the ones that are hurt or negatively impacted by a lot of conservative policies, Mormon women tend to still vote for them regardless. So just to clarify for extreme clarification purposes, when we think about in today's day and age, why Mormons are going to vote right-leaning or tend to vote for Republicans, there are a few concrete things that exist in the United States around that are Republican talking points, Republican platforms, that will generally mean that unless that changes, Mormons are going to vote Republican. This generally is linked to one of the biggest ones is reproductive rights specifically. According to Pew data, 70% of Mormons believe that reproductive care should be legal in most or all circumstances, should be illegal in most or all circumstances. Which is interesting considering the church's policies on these rights specifically, is there are exceptions that can be made for certain circumstances. The church was even anti-birth control, with a comment being made advocating against using it among married Mormons, even as recent as 2003. In recent years, we've seen a transition away from that where it's more of a between you and your husband type of thing. But for like more permanent terms of reproductive care, like vasectomies and things, those are things that you're still encouraged to talk about with your bishop first before you make a decision. And those align perfectly with the Republican platform, which is very restrictive of reproductive rights.
In regard to gay marriage, almost 70% of Mormons believe homosexuality should be discouraged by society. This is higher than most Protestants and Muslim data on the same question. 56% of members also say they prefer a small government with fewer services, which makes sense in the context of their history regarding what would be considered government overreach in their beliefs. Yet when asked about the government enforcing morality, 54% said that the government should take more of a role in enforcing morality. So
that's a classic.
Which is it?
You can't have your cake and eat it too.
Seriously.
Like either it's government overreach in terms of reproductive rights or it's small government. You can't have both.
It's like, you know how they have cafeteria Mormons?
Mm-hmm.
It's cafeteria conservatism.
Yes.
We're going to take a plate of don't touch my faith, but we're also going to take a faith of you better enforce my beliefs on everybody else.
Exactly. So the big political issues for Mormons, so much so that they're going to throw money behind them, like we saw with Prop 8, was specifically LGBTQ plus issues and generally reproductive rights. So makes the most sense that they're going to lean right because they're very passionate about banning and restricting those issues within the Republican Party. And Republicans in recent years have also made efforts to align themselves as more like religious or Christian oriented, with the left being kind of colloquially associated with like the godless atheists. So that very oversimplified perception alone will draw Mormons to the right anyway. Republicans also have a very deep passion for religious freedom and small government, which, as you can see from the previous data and Mormon history, is really balm to the Mormon soul. And the Second Amendment is also one that McKay brought up earlier that I think plays a role, especially because we had a conversation earlier where we kind of wondered about, is there potential, like, even trauma associated with past Mormon like ancestors of ours and pioneers who experienced like the religious persecution and the extermination order and those things. So there's kind of this awareness that the government is not safe and that at some point in your life you may have to fight the government, which kind of leads for some passion around owning firearms in the Second Amendment.
Obviously, that's just kind of conjecture.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't really have anything to base that on.
Leaves room for extremism.
Yeah. Now, looking at the 2024 election cycle, after President Biden announced that he was dropping out of the race and Kamala Harris and Tim Walz would take his place, there was a rejuvenation of energy among left-leaning Americans. In our experience, the vibe went from feeling like total lost cause to actually feeling hope again.
So progressive members have been involved this whole time. The Latter-day Saints for Parents movement has garnered a lot of attention in the last few months, including a lot of DMs from you guys asking us what the heck was that about, and it doesn't make any sense. This time around, it feels like members have received more attention from both campaigns, probably aware of their possible impact in critical swing states like we've talked about, like Arizona and Nevada. Both candidates even have a part of their website that specifically addresses Mormonism. Trump's talking specifically about how he's going to defend Latter-day Saints, and both have also had campaign events specifically speaking to members of the church. In an LDS for Harris campaign call in August, an associate professor from, interestingly enough, BYU, stated that Mormons in Arizona are poised to support Kamala Harris more than any other presidential Democratic ticket in 60 years. And the director of the LDS for Harris campaign stated that when Biden got 18% of the LDS vote in 2020, I think Harris could hit 25 to 30% of the LDS vote. Which, as you know, from the data points coming out of Arizona, that could swing Arizona for Kamala, further securing options for her path to 270. So I think there's lots of enthusiasm around like the progressive Mormons that are wanting to vote for Kamala, which I think is more enthusiasm than we felt in 2020.
And an equal and opposite reaction to the LDS for Kamala movement. Trump also launched his LDS for Trump coalition in October. He hosted a call that same month. He told folks on the Zoom call, all of us are united around the basic belief that faith in God and our Judeo-Christian values are essential to healthy American society. He called Mormons God-fearing American patriots, which I'm sure they loved. He said he and LDS voters held the same great values. Glenn Beck, strong opinions on the guy, but we're going to blaze right past that one. Blaze was also on this call, and he is obviously a huge political commentator and Mormon himself.
So Trump is a little bit behind in terms of trying to garner the LDS support and trailed Kamala in establishing that coalition that was focusing on LDS voters. Clearly his campaign manager maybe is thinking about a different path that maybe doesn't include Arizona, but it's interesting to me that both of them have prioritized LDS voters this time around, speaking to them specifically. And so we're seeing the importance of the LDS voting bloc in the election. And I am fascinated to see what will come of this. Particularly, we will be, as I'm an election data fiend, we will be closely watching Arizona and Nevada specifically.
We just kind of blasted you with a lot of information and backstory and things that might be able to inform you to draw a conclusion as to how we got to where we did with the Mormons and the Trumplicans and how their paths have crossed and everything like that. Because as far as everything that we have discussed leading up to this, in regard to that piece of candy with the your feelings, Trump 2020 bullshit attached to it, I sincerely have no idea how Mormons can act this way, because I know for a fact that they're going to fall for this con man just like they fell for Joseph Smith for 200 years at this point. Trump does not give a shit about them. He never has. Just like a lot of the evangelicals and other denominations, they do not consider them to be Christians. In cases like this where they're useful idiots, they will, placate their sensibilities and say, we believe the same thing, even though deep down in their core, they know for a fact that as soon as the time comes, they are going to cut them loose and say, see you later, suckers. It's been great. Thanks for all the help.
I mean, what part of sex with a porn star, cheating on my wife, kids with multiple different people, and all of the other heinous, horrible things he says falls into the same category as Mormon values? It just doesn't. It doesn't.
And against all odds, there are Mormons out there who are riding hard for Donald Trump, and it just
some to the point that it's even extreme
no
and probably needs its own video, because it leads to people doing crazy shit and extreme things when you have a religion that already has a propensity for encouraging extremism.
And we've discussed this in a lot of senses, and with the Trump era, we've seen a lot of schisms regarding how members act and how they defy the leaders' recommendations and things of the sort. There was a huge movement of people who did not want to receive the COVID vaccine, even after the prophet had recommended that people do so, because of bullshit politics like this. And it's really interesting to see how people who are like super into their faith can be swayed seemingly so easily by the words of politicians and things of that nature. But
at the end of the day, I think Trump has proven to me that it does not matter who sits in that seat. If they are a Republican and if they espouse that same bullshit about restricting reproductive rights, hating the gays, and being transphobic, then generally speaking, the majority of Mormons are going to vote for him. Like, it doesn't really matter who occupies the skin suit that's sitting there. It's really about what they're committed to doing, and it doesn't really matter who's there, which is really concerning, because at the beginning of this, we talked to you about how, in the beginning, most Mormons weren't comfortable with him, and rightfully so. But now we're in a position where a lot of people have seemingly forgotten that, or chosen to, because it's convenient, and because he's a Republican, and he's got the R behind his name, and he commits to doing a lot of things that Mormons really like, then the rest be damned, I guess.
Yeah.
Which is really disappointing for, a group that that tells people to vote regardless of party lines and to stand by people who have compassion and integrity. I don't see any of that here, but some people are absolutely convinced. And unfortunately, the things that Trump says that are racist, white supremacist in nature, those kinds of things, they might not be off-putting for Mormons. I hate to say it, but it might be kind of like a like calling to like situation here where there are still Mormons who have a lot of deep-rooted racism and homophobia and transphobia. And so the things that he says don't bother him like they bother us. And so that's also kind of concerning. But I think is a very valid part of this is that he speaks to those people.
I guess in summation, the conclusion that I'm arriving at as to why people are willing to act so unhinged for this man is because they see their true self in him. Maybe things that they don't want to admit, but they see the true self. There's the underpinnings of the church's racism, the sexism, and all the awful things that you see within the church, the greed and everything. You can see it reflected in him.
So I hope this was like a putting together a puzzle where we gave you all the pieces to explain why the behavior exists and how we got here and why they tend to vote Republican, and other than just the most obvious beliefs that they hold. But I think that the history, despite it being, long and detailed and vast, I think it plays a really important role in how Mormons show up politically today. So I hope that helped you put some pieces together and understand a lot of the context that exists around Mormonism and conservatism and the Republican Party.
All right, let's get off this crazy train. If you still live in the United States, then we're all stuck. But as far as
election anxiety, you're not alone.
Yes, as far as this goes, let's wrap it up in a nice little bow really fast. If you liked what you saw today, you can join the 100,000 other people and subscribe down below. If you'd like to support the channel further, you can become a member of the channel. We do live chats. You get cool little things in the live chat if you're a member, or you can become a patron. You get just as many perks there, except for the YouTube integrated type stuff. You can also follow our social media. You can find us on Instagram and TikTok at Jordan and McKay. We also have a Discord, which is where we do watch parties and things like that, which we're going to have stuff coming up to watch. Shout out Provost Most Eligible. Actually, we'll do that on stream because it's not like a copyright nightmare like
we'll be figuring
network
out
TV.
What we're watching next.
But yes, we have other things to watch, so keep your eyes out for those kinds of updates. Now that we're back, we've got ideas, we've got stuff coming down the pike, so be ready. But with that, we leave you.
We voted. We hope you voted.
Go out and vote if you live in the United States. And
if you haven't surpassed the deadline already.
Yes, if you are watching this now, it might be too late. So hopefully you already got that done. But we love you. You're awesome. And we will see you next time.